Welcome in. Tonight, we're traveling back to a time when marriage wasn't a milestone, it was a transaction. In the 1300s, a girl's future could be bartered over bread, sealed with a goat, and finalized before she'd learned how to spell her own name. Behind every dowry, every veil, every softly spoken vow was a life being reshaped to fit someone else's design. This isn't a tale of fairy tale weddings or romance by moonlight. It's a tapestry woven from silence, sacrifice, strategy, and yes, a little tenderness when the world allowed it. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it truly feels right. I'd also love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your side of the world. It's always comforting to see how far our small constellation of listeners reaches. Now, dim the lights, breathe a little deeper, and let the echoes of the medieval world unfold. Tonight, we step into the marriage market. The hall is quiet, save for the sound of low conversation coming from behind a wooden door that never quite closes. Inside, a man and two others speak in the language of arrangements, their words measured not by affection, but by what can be offered, secured, or exchanged. Just beyond the woven curtain separating them from the rest of the house, a girl sits perfectly still on a bench, her hands resting in her lap. She is not fidgeting. She has been taught not to. She is young, perhaps 12, but already understands that stillness is a form of currency. Her hair is tightly braided, her shoes too clean for comfort, and her dress, though simple, has been brushed free of lint with almost ceremonial care. This is not a normal day. This is the day her name begins to shift. She is not yet a bride, but she is no longer simply a daughter. Her presence here, silent and watched, marks the early phase of negotiation, not for love, but for legitimacy, security, reputation. No one in the other room will ask her what she wants. That was never part of the process. Instead, they will measure the weight of her family's offer. How many hens, how many bolts of cloth, whether the grain in the field will be ready in time to sweeten the deal. If she is lucky, they will include a story about her skill in churning butter, her obedience in church, her ability to hold her tongue. These are the things that matter. These are the things they say with pride. The girl listens, not because she is included, but because the silence she occupies is where her future is being shaped. She already knows this is normal. No one in the room thinks this is strange. The neighbor's daughter went through the same thing last spring, and the carpenter's niece was sent to her new household before her 13th name day. The girl does not cry. Crying would be shameful. She does not smile. Smiling might be misread. She waits, and the waiting becomes a kind of submission. Behind her, the fire burns low. The rushes on the floor smell faintly of damp straw and boiled onions. Somewhere outside, a dog barks once and then falls silent again. It is a world built from patterns and repetitions, and the marriage market is one of the oldest rhythms. Girls become offerings. Families make arrangements. Contracts are spoken softly, sealed by gestures more than ink. The girl blinks once, slowly. She will remember this moment, even if no one else does. It is the first time she feels herself become something traded, not sold exactly, but transferred, like land or debt. She has not yet said a word, but she is already being matched. The table was cleared of food long ago, but the conversation lingered like smoke in the beams above. Her father leaned forward now, elbow on wood, voice low and heavy with the weight of history. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking on behalf of generations who had arranged daughters before they even spoke their first prayers. The man across from him scratched at his beard and nodded without much emotion. He was not interested in her smile or the pitch of her voice. What mattered was how much land her father still held after the frost, and whether her mother's lineage was free of scandal. A girl in this context was not a person, but a promise. A seed that would be planted in someone else's soil, expected to grow straight and bear fruit. Her age was just a number, and usually not a high one. 13, maybe 14 if the family could afford to wait. Too old, and she might be seen as difficult. Too young, and the whispers might rise, but never loud enough to stop the process. The girl sat by the fire now, the curtain long drawn back, her posture composed, her presence expected but not included. She knew she was being looked at without being looked in the eye. Appraised, like a cloth bolt stretched across a merchant's arm. Her worth was being measured in parts: childbearing hips, steady hands, a quiet nature. She had all three, though no one had ever asked if she wanted them. Her mother stood behind her, one hand gently resting on her shoulder. It looked like comfort, but felt like restraint. The woman said nothing. Her face was neutral, but her grip was not. It held generations of understanding of what happens when a girl is spoken for. There would be no refusal, only small negotiations, a piece of jewelry held back, a promise of one visit home before winter. The girl did not interrupt. She knew better. The men spoke about dates, distances, dowries. Her name was used like a placeholder, as if it could be exchanged for another. And it could have. That was the truth no one ever said aloud. If the grain had failed, if her uncle had died in debt, if her mother had been born on the wrong side of the village, she might not be the one sitting here now. Someone else's daughter would take her place. But fortune had smiled just enough, and now she was the girl whose fate was being bartered for. She looked at the fire and tried to make it look like she wasn't listening. But she was. Every word, every number, every pause. She knew this was how girls disappeared, not into danger, but into arrangement. Not with screams, but with signatures no one would ever see. She rose before dawn the next morning, not because she was told to, but because sleep had become impossible. Her body ached from the straw mattress, and her thoughts were heavier than her limbs. In the gray hush before sunrise, the house was still, and only the dull thud of the bread paddle against the hearth broke the silence. She moved quietly, trained in small sounds and soft steps, and set to her tasks as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The night before, her father had returned from the neighbor's house with a different posture, less tired, more resolved. The kind of silence that follows a decision. Her mother did not speak over supper. Her brothers did not notice anything had shifted, though they would benefit most from the match. The field they had long struggled to harvest would be shared now. The new family had oxen. That meant a fuller yield, fewer wasted hours, more food through the winter. Her marriage would mean bread and bellies that were not hers. As she swept the hearth, her mind circled around a single phrase she had overheard the night before, that she was a good fit. Not a good match, not a joyful prospect. A fit. Like a piece of wood shaved to slot into place. Like iron hammered until it bent the right way. It was not cruel. It was just the language of survival. She knelt to scrape the ashes and wondered what her new hearth would look like. Would the stone be smoother? Would the fire catch faster? Would there be kindness in that house, or simply more expectations? She had not yet seen the man. He was older, that much was clear. A widower, likely. His first wife had died in childbirth, or maybe of fever. No one said it out loud, but the silence around it spoke louder than facts. He had 2 sons, both younger than she was. They would not call her mother, but she would serve them just the same. She was not being asked to start a family. She was being asked to complete one. When she stood, her knees cracked and her skirt smelled of ash. She did not mind the work. The work was the only part that made sense. You chop, you carry, you cook, you mend. But marriage, that was a story no one explained. It came not with stories, but with instructions. Her mother finally entered the room, face lined, eyes unreadable. She handed her a bundle of cloth and said, "You'll wear this when they visit." That was all. No warmth, no warning. Just a shift from girl to betrothed. The bundle was heavy in her arms. Linen, wool, and the weight of every woman who had once carried it before her. She held it and nodded. She did not cry. Crying would change nothing. The morning had broken, and with it, so had the last of her childhood. The bundle sat on the edge of her bed for days before she was told to open it. At first, she didn't dare touch it, as if unwrapping the cloth would somehow make the arrangement real. She passed it every morning when she rose to tend the hearth, and every night when she returned from fetching water, she saw it sitting there like a quiet verdict. The cloth itself was plain, rough-spun linen dyed a dusty brown, the kind that faded quickly after a season in the sun. But inside, carefully folded and bound with twine, were things that had once belonged to another woman, perhaps a cousin, perhaps someone who had died in childbirth. No one explained. The gown was modest, its hem mended twice, its sleeves faded where the arms would have rubbed against the edge of a work table. Alongside it was a veil, yellowed but clean, and a single pewter brooch in the shape of a rose. Not beautiful, but deliberate. These were not gifts. They were signals. Signals that she was ready to be seen, ready to be evaluated. The visit was coming soon. Her father said it like one might say, "Rain is coming," not with joy, not with dread, just inevitability. The man who had asked about her would arrive, perhaps with his brother or steward, and they would sit and drink and glance and nod. She would be expected to serve them without stumbling, to speak if spoken to, and to smile but not too much. Too much joy might be mistaken for forwardness, too little for ingratitude. Her mother instructed her in these things late at night when the boys had gone to sleep and the fire was low. The words were soft, measured. Don't laugh too loud. Keep your eyes lowered when they enter. Offer the bread first to the guest, then to your father. And remember, she added, you are not being sold. You are being honored. That word stuck in her throat long after the fire went out. Honored. She repeated it silently as she washed her face the next morning, as she folded her apron, as she scraped the pot clean. She didn't feel honored. She felt packaged. Chosen, yes. But for what, she wasn't certain. She had never spoken to a man outside her family, not in more than a word or two at market. Now she would be someone's wife before she knew the shape of his voice. The bundle sat there still, unopened, waiting for her to become ready. But she wasn't sure what that meant. How does a girl become ready to give her life to someone she has never met? She touched the brooch gently one night, just to feel its weight in her hand. It was colder than she expected. She didn't cry. That part of her, too, was being taught silence, not by force, but by repetition, and by watching every woman around her carry her quiet like a second skin. The day of the visit arrived without ceremony. No one said much at breakfast, and the girl could feel her heart beat in places that had never ached before. She dressed early, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the worn brooch at the base of her neck. Her mother helped her braid her hair tighter than usual, pulling with a firm, steady rhythm that felt more like preparation than grooming. Outside, the light was soft and uncertain, a thin veil of mist hovering over the thatched roofs and muddy paths. She watched through the slits in the shutters as the figures approached on horseback. Two men, both cloaked, the elder of the two dismounting first. That would be him, she thought, the man she was meant to serve, to follow, to obey. She did not know if he was kind. No one ever mentioned kindness. They spoke of holdings, of timber and grain, of how well he had managed his estate since his wife died last winter. The younger man remained near the horses, checking saddlebags and rubbing at his neck with a cloth. The girl took a breath as her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. "Now," she whispered. And with that, the girl stepped out of the shadows of the back room and into the front chamber, where the fire was lit, and her father stood ready with a jug of ale. The man turned when she entered. His eyes were dark, his beard trimmed, his expression unreadable. He was neither cruel nor kind, just watchful. She lowered her gaze as she had been taught, then offered him a small nod and turned to fetch the bread from the table. Her hands were steady now. She had practiced this movement a dozen times in the days before, her mother guiding her with silent corrections. He sat without waiting to be asked, as was custom, and spoke softly to her father about livestock, the strength of the last barley harvest, and the mill repairs downriver. Her name was mentioned once, briefly, with a nod in her direction. She kept her posture straight and her face calm. There was no talk of poetry, no questions about what she liked or feared or hoped. That was not the point. The girl was present as proof, proof that her family could provide, proof that she was modest and healthy, proof that the arrangement would be simple. When the conversation paused, her mother gently handed her a small plate of cheese and motioned for her to offer it to the guest. She did so with a slight bow, the edge of her sleeve brushing the table. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, not long enough for anything to be said, but long enough for her to feel the shape of his scrutiny. She stepped back quietly, returning to her place near the hearth. This was not courtship, it was confirmation. And in that moment, she realized the decision had already been made. That night, the house was quieter than usual, not because the visit had gone poorly, but because it had gone exactly as expected. There were no surprises, no dramatic moments to recount. The men had spoken, the girl had been seen, and the necessary pleasantries had been exchanged. Now, the family waited. Her father sat by the hearth, staring into the flame with a slight crease in his brow, as if calculating something invisible. Her mother moved about the room with a practiced calm, refolding cloth, rinsing bowls, resetting the day's rhythm. But the girl felt something under her skin had shifted. She wasn't sure what it was, only that the world now saw her differently. The gown she wore earlier still hung on the peg near the door, its brooch glinting faintly in the firelight. She had taken it off carefully, not because it was delicate, but because it seemed to belong to someone else now. A version of herself who smiled at a stranger and handed him cheese as if that were normal. She sat on the edge of her straw bed and watched the fire die slowly, the red coals dimming into ash. She didn't cry. Crying still felt too loud, too childish. Instead, she thought about the man's eyes. Not unkind, but not curious either. He had looked at her the way one looks at a fence before buying the land beside it. Not with wonder, but with assessment. That had startled her more than anything. She had prepared for coldness, maybe even for discomfort. But what she had not prepared for was how indifferent it would all feel. She wanted to ask her mother what happened next. Would there be another visit? Would she be sent away suddenly? Or would they wait until the harvest was done? But she knew better than to speak questions aloud at this stage. There were rules for everything, including silence. Instead, she lay down and listened to the soft shuffle of her mother's feet as she moved through the room, extinguishing candles. When the light finally vanished and the room was cloaked in shadow, she stared up at the wooden beams above her head and tried to imagine what her new life might sound like. Would the floorboards creak the same way in his house? Would she rise before dawn there too, stoking a different fire, fetching water from a different well? Would anyone notice if she was unhappy? She didn't think so. Unhappiness wasn't measured in this world, only obedience, only usefulness. She curled onto her side and pulled the wool blanket over her shoulders. It smelled faintly of the chest it had been stored in, cedar and old smoke. Somewhere in the dark, her mother whispered a single prayer, not to comfort, but out of habit. The girl closed her eyes and let the quiet press down around her. The match had been seen, and though no one had spoken the words yet, she knew the answer was yes. The next morning arrived like every other, but something was missing in the air, a kind of stillness that felt both too calm and too final. Her brothers bickered over boots by the doorway, unaware or uninterested in what had unfolded. Her father had already gone out to speak with a neighbor, perhaps to confirm a detail or make a delivery that would signal acceptance. But inside the house, the women moved differently. Her mother said nothing about the visit, but her hands were busy from the moment she rose. She scrubbed the floor with more force than usual, dusted the corners with the precision of someone expecting to be judged. The girl followed her cues without question, rising from bed and slipping into her daily tasks, like one stepping onto a familiar path that now led somewhere unfamiliar. They worked side by side in silence, yet the air between them buzzed with unspoken knowing. And then, with no warning, her mother looked up and said, "When I met your father, I didn't like the way he chewed." The girl blinked, startled. It was not the sort of thing her mother ever said. Not a confession, not a memory, certainly not something shared during chores. But the words hung there, suspended in the dusty morning light, and her mother let out a breath before continuing. "He said 2 words to me that first day. 'It'll do.' That was what he said to my father. That was my welcome." She didn't sound angry. She didn't sound sad. She sounded tired, as if recounting a story she had held in her mouth too long. The girl didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She merely handed her mother the next pot to scrub. "It wasn't bad," her mother added after a moment. "He worked hard, never struck me, kept food on the table. That was more than some women got." Then she fell silent again, and the two returned to the rhythm of their work. But the girl carried those words with her all day. Not bad, that was the height of hope. Not cruel, not starved, not broken, just not bad. In the space between those expectations, entire lives unfolded. She wondered if her mother had ever cried for what might have been, or if that kind of longing was simply something you learned to pack away like winter clothes. The girl peeled onions for the stew and thought about the shape of her own silence. She wondered what her first conversation with her husband would be, if he would speak at all, if he would see her, truly see her, or simply nod and wait for the house to mold her into usefulness. As the sun sank and the stew simmered, she caught her mother watching her for a brief moment, not judging, not instructing, but remembering. That, more than any blessing, felt like the closest thing to understanding she would receive. The first sign that the match was confirmed came not from her father's mouth, but from the sudden change in her chores. She was no longer sent to weed the garden or help her brothers patch the fence. Instead, her mother kept her inside, assigning her quieter, cleaner tasks. Sewing, mending, folding, the kinds of things a wife should already know how to do, the kinds of things that couldn't risk bruising her hands or smudging her skin. At first, she didn't notice. Work was work, and there was always plenty of it. But then, on the third morning, when she rose with the sun and reached for her apron, her mother stopped her with a gentle shake of the head. "Not that one," she said, and handed her a cleaner one with embroidery along the edge. It was the apron her mother wore on saints' days and visits from kin, and the girl looked at it now with a quiet weight settling into her chest. The preparation had begun, not just of the house, but of her. She was being reshaped without anyone needing to say it aloud. Her braids were tied tighter, her posture corrected more often. When she served bread, her mother watched her movements, offering small nods or brief touches that guided her like a puppet being rehearsed for performance. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't even cold, it was precise. This, her mother seemed to say without speaking, is how we get through it. The girl obeyed. She tried not to think too hard. When she pricked her finger while sewing a tear in her shawl, she didn't wince. She wiped the blood on her skirt and kept stitching. Her mother saw it, but said nothing. That too was part of the training. That week, two women from a neighboring house came by to offer congratulations, though they spoke in the odd, careful tone adults used when speaking to children who had no say in their fate. One gave her a small pouch of lavender for her linens. The other examined her hands and said, "You'll be fine." The words were not comforting. They were instructional. Fine meant bearable. Fine meant quiet. Fine meant survival. That night, the girl sat alone on the edge of her bed and looked out the small window above the firewood pile. The moon hung heavy and dull, casting its pale light across the rooftops. Somewhere nearby, a child was crying. Not in pain, but in protest. The tired, high-pitched wail of a child who had not yet learned to submit. The girl listened, unmoving, until the sound faded into the night. She did not cry. She had moved past the point where tears felt useful. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and stared at the dark cloth of her dress. It was not yet her wedding day, but everything that mattered had already been decided. When the second visit came, the house smelled of vinegar and soap. Her mother had spent the better part of the day boiling cloth and scrubbing the table until her knuckles were raw. The girl had helped without complaint, moving through the rooms like someone trying not to disturb the air. She knew now what was expected. This was not a time for questions or confusion. This was a rehearsal turned performance. She wore the dress again, the brown one with the stitched hem, and this time her hair was pinned up rather than braided. She didn't recognize her own reflection in the tin mirror. Her eyes looked older, not because of age, but because of knowing. The man returned in the late afternoon with a different companion, his sister perhaps, or a cousin. A woman, older, with sharp features and quiet eyes. They were greeted at the door with practiced warmth. Her father bowed slightly. Her mother offered ale and bread. The girl did as she had been instructed, stepping forward with her plate, offering the cheese, nodding politely. She said thank you when prompted. She spoke slowly, carefully, and kept her eyes low but not hidden. It was a delicate line to walk. Too quiet, and they would think her dull. Too bold, and they would think her improper. She had rehearsed this balance in her mind for days. The woman's gaze lingered longer than the man's had. She asked the girl to sit beside her for a moment, to speak about how she spent her days. The girl described her work at the hearth, her skill with bread dough, how she could sew a clean hem even in poor light. These were the correct answers. They were not lies, but they were not truths either. She did not mention that she sometimes whispered songs to herself while washing the floor, or that she once stole a piece of sugared plum from the cupboard just to feel what disobedience tasted like. Those parts of her had no place in this room. When the visit ended, the girl watched the man mount his horse without a glance in her direction. The woman gave her a small nod and turned away. No one spoke for a while after they left. Her father stared into the fire. Her mother kneaded dough with more force than needed. The girl returned to her chores. That night, as the house grew dark, her mother approached her by the bed and handed her a folded cloth. Inside it was a small comb made of carved wood and a strip of pale linen. "You'll want these," her mother said, and left the room without waiting for thanks. The girl ran her fingers along the edge of the comb and sat very still. She wasn't afraid. Fear was loud, and what she felt now was something quieter, something heavier. She had passed the test. She had performed well. She would be married. The word came 2 days later, carried by a boy on a tired horse. He handed her father a folded scrap of parchment sealed with wax, then turned and rode off without waiting for anything in return. Her father broke the seal without ceremony, read the contents once, then placed the letter on the table and said nothing for nearly an hour. No announcement, no speech, just silence, thick and deliberate. The girl had seen enough to understand that silence was not absence, it was confirmation. It was the shape that approval took in their world. Her mother read the letter next, eyes flicking over the lines before folding it again and slipping it into the pocket of her apron. She said nothing, only turned to the hearth and began preparing the stew as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The girl sat on her stool by the door and waited, unsure if this was the moment when her life would be spoken aloud. No one addressed her. No one needed to. The decision had been made, and now it only needed to be obeyed. Later that evening, her mother handed her a list. Short, hand-scrawled, barely legible. It was a preparation list. Items to be gathered, cloth to be washed, bread to be baked. Instructions not for a celebration, but for a transition. Her wedding was to be held in 4 weeks, after the barley was in and the roads less thick with mud. She would leave with 1 cart, 2 chickens, a blanket woven by her grandmother, and whatever quiet pride her family could afford to show. She studied the list as if reading a script for a role she hadn't chosen but would be expected to play convincingly. Her name did not appear on the paper. Only chores, only items, only movement. That night she lay in bed beneath a patched wool blanket and tried to remember what it felt like not to be seen as a bride. She reached backward through her memory, trying to find a version of herself who had no future hanging over her head like a shadow pinned to the wall. But that girl had already started fading. In her place was someone else, someone quieter, steadier, more practiced, someone whose hands had learned not to shake. She turned to face the window, where the stars blinked like signals from a distant world. No one had asked her if she wanted this. They had only asked if she was ready. And readiness, in this place, was not measured by the heart. It was measured by how well you folded your linens, how softly you spoke, how little space you took up in a room where men made plans. Her mother entered just once before sleep, pressed a palm gently to her forehead, and said, "You'll do well." Then she left. The door creaked shut behind her. The girl closed her eyes. 4 weeks. That was all. In the days that followed, time began to move differently. The morning light felt thinner, as though filtered through something unseen, and the rhythm of her chores took on a new kind of weight. Every task was now a step toward departure. Every bowl scrubbed, every stitch sewn, brought her closer to a life she had never asked for but was expected to accept without hesitation. Her mother no longer needed to instruct her. The girl knew what to do. She folded her garments in neat bundles, laid out strips of cloth for wrapping cheese and dried herbs, and checked the seams of her winter shawl for wear. Her fingers moved with the precision of someone who had made peace with the inevitability of work. There was no room for wonder, no room for sorrow. Those things, if they had ever belonged to her, had long been folded and packed away. On the 3rd day, she was sent to visit the village seamstress, a widow named Runa, who lived alone at the edge of the road where the path turned toward the river. Runa had stitched the wedding garments of nearly every girl in the parish, and now it was the girl's turn. She walked the muddy road with a bundle of fabric pressed to her chest, the weight of it warming her ribs through her shawl. The wind carried the scent of wet hay and distant hearth smoke. When she arrived, Runa was already waiting. The woman said little, only motioned for her to come inside and remove her outer garments. The fitting was quiet. The girl stood still as pins were tucked and adjusted along her waist. Runa's fingers were quick, her gaze unreadable. After a while, she paused, then said softly, "You've your mother's shoulders. She stood here just the same when she was your age." The girl didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Runa nodded as if she had expected the silence. She wept afterward, not while I was working, but once the pins were out, she wept. The girl looked away. She would not weep. Not here. Not now. Runa said nothing more. She stitched the hem, folded the edges, and returned the gown with quiet reverence. It was plain, as expected. No embroidery, no lace, no ribbon, just honest fabric, dyed in walnut and stitched with care. It would do. The girl walked back home in the late afternoon light, her bundle pressed tight against her chest once more. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel dread. She felt held in place, like a candle just before the flame is lit, not yet burning, but already shaped for fire. When she reached the door, her mother greeted her with a small nod, then returned to kneading dough. The house smelled of bread and wool and something older, something quieter. The girl climbed the ladder to her bed, unfolded the dress, and stared at it in her lap. The pins were gone, but the shape remained. The first of the farewells came at dusk, when the air was still and the road outside lay empty. Her aunt arrived with a pot of broth and a folded cloth filled with dried berries, pressed into her hands with a mixture of formality and restrained tenderness. They sat by the hearth without speaking much. Words were never expected in moments like this, only presence. The girl listened as the wood crackled, and her aunt murmured a few blessings under her breath, the kind old women carry like heirlooms. Later, the village midwife stopped by and gave her a carved wooden spoon, worn smooth by decades of stirring. "Every woman needs one of her own," she said, and then she left without asking anything of the girl in return. These visits were not meant to comfort. They were offerings. Small, quiet things passed from one woman to another, not because they erased what was coming, but because they were the only things left to give when words would fail. The girl placed the gifts in a basket beside her bed and sat looking at them as if they might begin to speak. But they didn't. They simply existed, relics of a life that was already starting to fall behind her. Her days were filled now with instructions wrapped in affection, how to fold sheets so the corners stayed flat, how to season meat when salt was scarce, how to endure without appearing ungrateful. Her mother never said these things as commands. She said them like stories. "When I first went to your father's house, I didn't speak for a week," she said one morning while they scrubbed the kettle. "Not because I was afraid, because I didn't know what version of myself I was allowed to bring with me." The girl nodded but didn't speak. She understood. That was the unspoken part of all these lessons. Not how to be married, but how to disappear without losing your shape. Each passing day peeled another layer of girlhood from her shoulders. The games she had once played with pebbles and string now felt distant, almost childish. She had not laughed in weeks. Not because she had no reason, but because laughter no longer belonged in the room where women readied themselves to leave. At night, she found herself watching the moon more than sleeping, tracing its slow arc across the sky like it held some secret path beyond the ones carved in mud. The wedding was near now. Only days remained. Her belongings were already tied with twine, her dress folded in cloth, her shoes scrubbed until they shone like polished bark. There would be no feast, only bread and stew. No procession, only a walk to a different door. She sat quietly in the corner of the room that had been hers since she was small, breathing in the scent of drying herbs and hearth smoke. And for the first time, she let herself feel it. Not sorrow, not hope, but the soft, aching knowledge that she would not return here again. In the final days before she left, the house began to move around her like a memory already forming. The floorboards creaked with familiarity, but each sound felt like an echo. She no longer belonged fully to this space. Her body still occupied the corners of the kitchen, the threshold of the doorway, the shadow beneath the rafters. But her name now belonged to another household. It was spoken elsewhere, alongside someone else's. She was being folded into a new shape. Her brothers grew quieter in her presence, not from malice but from uncertainty. They did not know how to say goodbye to someone still breathing the same air. So instead they avoided her gaze, passed the bread in silence, and returned to their chores with more energy than needed. Her mother remained steady, always moving, always preparing. She sewed the last of the linens, packed the jars of dried apples, stitched a fresh hem on the girl's shawl with fingers that did not tremble. And yet, there was something in her posture that had shifted. Not hesitation, but a slowness born from knowing that some losses come not with death, but with distance. On the morning before the wedding, they boiled lavender into the wash water, and for once the house smelled almost sweet. The girl was scrubbed, her nails cleaned, her hair combed and oiled until it shone like dark grain in the sun. She did not protest. She held still as her mother worked, her eyes closed, her breath even. It felt like being carved. She was no longer being readied. She was being finished. Later that day, she was taken to the church, not for the ceremony, but for a final confession. The priest asked her if she was ready. She said yes, though the word barely touched her tongue. He asked if she entered the union of her own will. She nodded. No one asked her if she felt joy. That was not part of the ritual. She was handed a small silver token, shaped like a cross, to carry with her into her new life. Not as a blessing, but as a marker, a reminder of the vow she would soon speak. That evening she sat with her mother by the fire, neither of them speaking. The flames crackled, the wind tapped gently at the shutters, and somewhere outside, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Her mother handed her a small bundle of herbs tied with red thread. "For the aches," she said, and pressed it into her daughter's hand. The girl held it tightly, not because she needed it, but because it was the last gift her mother would give her before she became someone else's. She looked at the fire for a long time, letting its warmth seep into her skin. Tomorrow, she would walk through a different door. Tomorrow, she would wear the dress, speak the words, and cross the threshold into the life that had been arranged for her before she knew how to want anything else. The morning of her wedding arrived without ceremony, just the soft sound of rain tapping against the roof and the smell of ash clinging to the hearth. She woke before the others, her body restless with an energy that wasn't quite fear, but something close to it. She sat up in the dim light, listening to the silence of the house she had lived in all her life. The walls felt closer now, like they were already pulling away from her. She dressed slowly, unfolding the gown from its cloth wrapping, careful not to wrinkle the hem her mother had ironed the night before with a hot stone wrapped in linen. The wool was plain, but clean, and when she fastened the old brooch at her collar, she felt its weight settle against her skin like a hand. Downstairs, her mother moved without sound, already preparing a small loaf and a pot of tea. They did not speak. There were no grand words, no reassurances, just motion, the language of hands. Her father stood outside by the cart, speaking with the man who would take her to the chapel. Not the groom, but one of his kin. The groom would meet her there. That was how it was done. Practical, simple, quiet. When it was time, her mother pressed a kiss to her forehead and handed her a cloth pouch containing the carved spoon, the dried herbs, and the lavender sachet. "Keep it near you," she said. "It's not much, but it's yours." The girl nodded. She could not speak. Her throat was thick with everything she wanted to ask and knew she could not. Her brothers remained inside, watching from the corner of the room. One lifted a hand, in a motion that might have been a wave. It was enough. She stepped into the cart, rain misting her shoulders, and took one last look at the house. The stones beneath the windowsill, the sag in the doorframe, the bundle of firewood leaning just so against the wall. Every detail was carved into her like a memory she would be forced to carry without proof. The wheels turned. Mud splashed softly beneath them. No songs marked the journey. No flowers, no parade, just the sound of hooves and the rustle of wet trees. The road curved around the hill, and she looked back only once. The house was already gone from view. She did not cry, not out of strength, but because there was no space for tears anymore. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers curled around the pouch, and she whispered a prayer to no one in particular. Not for joy, not even for peace, just for the strength to become what everyone already believed she was. The chapel stood at the edge of the village, half swallowed by ivy and mist. It was small, stone-built, and old in a way that made everything around it seem temporary. The air smelled of damp wood and the faint smoke of candles already lit within. She stepped down from the cart without help, her feet sinking slightly into the wet ground. The door creaked when it opened, and the silence inside greeted her like a held breath. The pews were mostly empty. Only a few witnesses had been invited: her father's cousin, the man's steward, 2 village elders, and the priest. Her future husband stood near the altar, his back to her, speaking in low tones with the man beside him. When he turned, his expression did not change. He did not smile, nor did he frown. His eyes passed over her, like a page turned in a book already read. She did not know what she had expected. She had never imagined this moment clearly. All she knew was that she had arrived, and that meant it would happen. The priest spoke without waiting. The words were familiar, part of the rhythm of every life in the parish. A man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave unto his wife. Her voice joined his only when prompted, soft and steady, as rehearsed. She vowed to obey, to labor, to endure. He vowed to protect, to provide. The priest asked if they entered freely. They both said yes. No one questioned whether freedom was a matter of choice or simply the absence of resistance. When it was done, the priest placed a hand on their joined hands and said the final blessing. There was no applause, only the rustle of cloth and the scent of burning tallow. The girl did not feel changed. She felt rearranged. She turned to face the pews and caught her father's eye for a moment. He nodded once, not with pride, but with completion. Her mother had not come. That was not custom. Women left through one door, entered through another, and did not look back. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray and low. Her husband offered his arm. She took it. His sleeve was rough wool, damp from where it had brushed the cart earlier. They walked to the waiting cart in silence. No bells rang. No music played. The wind rustled the trees overhead, and the cart creaked as they stepped inside. The road home, her new home, stretched ahead, winding and narrow. She glanced down at her hands in her lap, still holding the pouch her mother had given her. She had not opened it yet. She would wait until she was alone, if she was ever alone again. The man beside her said nothing, but she felt the gravity of his presence. Not cruel, not tender, just solid. The cart began to move, and with it, the last of her old name slipped away into the morning mist. The house was smaller than she expected, not in size, but in feeling. The walls leaned inward slightly, the windows narrow and tucked beneath the thatch like eyes too tired to open fully. It sat on the slope of a low hill overlooking a field of sodden earth, freshly turned and lined with furrows like ribs in the ground. The cart pulled into the yard, and no one came to greet them. There had been no feast, no procession, no songs, just the slow sound of arrival. Her husband dismounted first, then turned to offer his hand. She hesitated for the briefest moment before taking it. His fingers were calloused, cool from the damp, and when they brushed hers, she felt a flicker of something, not comfort, but reality. He led her inside without a word. The doorway was low, and she ducked as she stepped into the room. The floor was packed earth. The hearth was small, with a single pot resting above a cold bed of ashes. A wooden table sat beneath the window, and 3 chairs surrounded it, 2 for grown hands, 1 for a child. On a bench near the wall, a pair of boys watched her with wide, unreadable eyes. They did not speak. They simply stared. She offered a quiet nod, the way she had been taught. They turned their heads slightly, then looked away. This was her welcome. Her husband showed her the bed she would share, the shelf where her things might sit, the cloth sack of flour hanging on the peg by the door. Then he left again, to the field, or the woodpile, or perhaps simply to give her space to find her place. The silence he left behind was almost generous. She unpacked slowly, her fingers careful over every item. She placed the carved spoon beside the hearth, tucked the lavender pouch beneath her shawl, and folded her linens on the bench by the window. Then she sat, still in her wedding gown, still unspoken, still invisible. The boys had disappeared somewhere deeper into the house, or perhaps outside. She did not call after them. She did not know if she was meant to. The wind pressed against the shutters, and a bird called out once from the rafters above. Her shoulders ached. Her feet were cold. And still, she sat. She took out the pouch, opened it, and let the dried herbs rest in her palm for a moment. They smelled like home, like the kitchen hearth, the edges of her mother's sleeve, the corners of her old bed. She closed her eyes and let the scent fill the space around her, as if it could carve a small circle of belonging in a place that had not yet made room for her. When she opened her eyes again, the room was still unchanged, but she was inside it now, and that, it seemed, was the only thing that mattered. The first week passed like water slipping through a narrow crack, slow at first, then gone before she could hold on to it. Mornings began before the sun, not with a voice calling her name, but with the sound of movement. A ladle clinking against the pot, the dull thud of boots on packed earth, the creak of the door opening to mist and field. Her husband rose early, always wordless, his movements practiced and unsentimental. He left her a small bit of bread on the table each morning, not from kindness, but from habit. She took it, and that became the rhythm between them, the sharing of space without the asking of questions. The boys, too, began to orbit her with quiet caution. They watched her from behind the corners of doorways, studied the way she tied her apron, the way she salted the stew, the way she moved through rooms as though she were still waiting to be told she could stay. One of them, the younger, dropped a carved button on the table one afternoon while she was mending socks. He didn't say anything, just placed it there and walked away. She understood that gesture better than any greeting. Slowly, without realizing it, she began to move as if the house had always known her. She added a second log to the fire when it was cold. She rearranged the jars so that flour and oats were within reach. She wiped the soot from the hearthstone with a cloth her mother had sewn, and as she did, she felt the line between old and new begin to blur. No one told her she was doing well. No one said her name with affection, but no one stopped her either. And in this world, that was as good as being welcomed. She didn't speak much to her husband. They shared meals in silence, and sometimes she caught him looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Not with longing, not with judgment, but with curiosity, as though trying to guess how she would last. On the fourth day, he returned from the field with a cut on his palm. She took his hand without asking, cleaned it with vinegar, and wrapped it in cloth. He didn't flinch. He only nodded once and left the room. That night, he didn't leave the last bite of stew for himself. He pushed it toward her without a word. She didn't thank him. She simply took it. The exchange was small, nearly invisible, but it lived in the quiet between them, like a thread being tied without a knot. In her room, her corner of the room, she kept the pouch beside her bed, the brooch resting beside it. She didn't look at them every day, but she needed to know they were there. Proof that she had not been born only to this life, but had come from somewhere and carried something with her, even if it was just the memory of her own name whispered once into the wind. The days folded into one another like worn pages in a book too often read. There was no clock, only the sun, and no calendar, only the planting of seed and the stirring of pots. Her body adjusted before her mind did. She woke before the boys, swept the floor before it asked, stirred porridge before hunger had even arrived. She did not do it to please anyone. She did it to hold herself in place. She began learning the house by sound, the way the rafters groaned in the rain, the precise creak of the door hinge when it swung inward too fast, the murmur of her husband's voice when he muttered to the oxen behind the barn. Her name, spoken aloud, had become a rare thing. The boys called her mother in time, though their voices faltered at first, unsure if it fit or if it would stick. She didn't correct them. She accepted it like a garment too big for now, but warming all the same. Her husband still said little, but he began to notice what she did. Once he returned from the fields to find the wash hung in a new pattern, sheets first, then shirts, then small garments for the boys, all pinned with twine instead of string. He said nothing, but the next morning he left her a new length of rope beside the bucket. Another time she patched a tear in his tunic with wool from her dowry cloth, dyed the soft gray of ash. The next time he wore it, he left the cloak unfastened just long enough for her to see he had noticed. These things were not affection. They were alignment, a kind of mutual fluency in a language neither had been taught, but both needed to speak. In the evenings, she sat by the hearth and taught the younger boy how to braid straw into figures. He laughed once, a short, surprised sound, when his bird-shaped braid came out lopsided. She didn't laugh, but she smiled. That smile was enough to carry her through the next day. When night came, she still reached for the small pouch beside her bed. She didn't always open it. Sometimes just the weight of it in her hand was enough. A quiet tether to who she had been, to where she had come from. She spoke no prayers aloud, but sometimes in the silence she whispered names to herself. Her mother, her father, the old priest with the kind eyes, her aunt who brought broth. These names had no place in this house, but she carried them like stones in her pocket, reminders that she had been something else before she became what she was now. And slowly, the house too began to carry her. Not with warmth, not yet, but with the steady, unspeaking patience of a place learning how to hold a new voice in its walls. By the third week, she no longer hesitated before entering any room. She no longer stepped around corners as though she might disturb something fragile. The house had not changed, but her shape within it had. She could feel it in the way her feet found the crevices in the floor without looking, the way her hands knew where the ladle hung even in the dark. The walls no longer loomed. They leaned gently, like trees in an old forest making space for something new to grow. She still didn't speak much, but she no longer feared the sound of her own voice. Once she asked the older boy if he liked his stew with more onions. He shrugged and said, "I don't know. I never thought about it." That made her pause. Not because the answer was wrong, but because it reminded her that not everyone had been taught to examine what they liked, only what they were given. That evening she put fewer onions in the stew. Not for him, for herself. She preferred it that way. The change was small, but it rooted something inside her. She was allowed to shape her world, even in modest ways. One afternoon, while scrubbing the hearth, she uncovered a scrap of parchment beneath a loose stone, a torn edge of some long-forgotten page, its writing nearly gone. She traced her fingers over the faint lines, then folded it and placed it inside her pouch. It had no meaning, but it felt like a message, a sign that this house had a past she hadn't been told, and that she now shared in its keeping. Her husband returned late that night, wet from the rain, the smell of cut grass heavy on his sleeves. She helped him remove his boots without being asked. He said thank you, the words almost an accident. She nodded, not smiling, but not cold. There was no fire between them, but there was no wall either. They existed in parallel, not lovers, not strangers, just two souls trying to stay warm in the same room. The next morning, she found a bunch of early daisies on the kitchen table. They were not in a vase, just scattered, damp and messy, left without note or explanation. She said nothing about them. She swept them gently into a bowl, placed them beside the window, and let the light catch their wet petals. That day, the house felt almost like it was breathing with her. Not in joy, not in sorrow, just in time. She continued to whisper names at night, though sometimes she replaced the old ones with new ones. The boys, the ox, the village seamstress who once stitched her wedding dress without pity. The names, spoken only to the dark, reminded her that she was still here, still real. Her story had not stopped. It had only begun again, in quieter ink. The morning began like any other, fog curling low against the fields, the sound of hooves clattering somewhere beyond the trees. But there was something in the air that made her stop as she stepped outside. It wasn't a smell or a sound. It was the weight of the silence. Not empty, but expectant. The boys were still asleep. Her husband had already gone to the field. She stood alone for a moment in the yard, hands wrapped around a bucket of water, and simply listened. The stillness didn't frighten her anymore. It had become a kind of companion, a space she could enter without fear of what might greet her there. Back inside, she began her morning tasks. But she moved slower now, not with laziness, but with care. She had learned the rhythm of this place, when the light hits the kitchen wall, when the wind slips through the chimney flue, when the bread needs more flour, and when it doesn't. These were not great achievements, but they were hers. And that, she was learning, mattered. That day, the older boy returned from a walk with a dead bird in his hands. He held it awkwardly, unsure whether to bury it or offer it as some strange token of help. She met him by the door, took the bird gently, and wrapped it in a cloth. "Let's give it a place," she said. Together they dug a small hole by the edge of the vegetable plot. No ceremony, just hands in the dirt. Afterward, she asked him if he'd like to learn how to braid rushes into a rope. He nodded. That afternoon, the two of them sat beneath the bare branches behind the barn, weaving strands into patterns while the younger boy played nearby, mimicking her motions with sticks. For the first time since she arrived, there was laughter, brittle and cautious, but real. She didn't join in, but her lips curved just slightly, and that was enough to shift the entire day. Her husband returned just after dusk, his tunic wet from sweat and rain. She handed him a cloth to dry his brow. He took it without hesitation. Then, without looking at her, he said, "The boys seem lighter." She nodded once. That was the closest he had come to a compliment. She didn't need more. Later that night, after the boys were asleep and the fire had settled into low embers, she pulled out her pouch and opened it slowly. The dried herbs were brittle now, the lavender faded, but tucked between them was the scrap of parchment she had found by the hearth, still unreadable, still faint. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. She didn't speak any names this time. She didn't need to. The silence was no longer hollow. It was filled with everything she had quietly claimed as her own. She began to mark the days, not with ink or charcoal, but with gesture. Every seventh morning, she would bake a second loaf of bread, one for the family, one to give away. Sometimes she left it on the doorstep of the old woman who lived near the edge of the forest road, the one who rarely came into town anymore. Other times she left it by the chapel, where the stone was always cold and the priest had grown thin with age. She never said she was doing it. She simply did. And slowly, the act carved out something inside her that had not yet existed. A sense of movement outward. A sense that not everything had to be inherited. Some things could be chosen. Her husband noticed. He didn't say anything directly, but he began leaving her a little more flour than usual, setting it on the table in the evenings as if to say, "Keep going." The boys noticed too. They watched her more openly now, not with suspicion, but with the simple curiosity of those learning how the world is stitched together. One morning, the younger one asked her if she had always known how to make stew that tasted like home. She didn't know how to answer that. She only smiled and stirred a little longer. The house too had softened. The wind no longer rattled the shutters as sharply. The fire caught on the first try most days. Even the hens, moody creatures in the best of seasons, began laying again. These were small things, invisible things, but they shaped the air. They shaped the way she walked through the rooms. On one rare afternoon, when the weather cleared, she sat in the patch of sunlight by the door and began to hum, not loudly, not for anyone, just a tune she remembered from her mother's spindle. The older boy paused when he heard it, then sat beside her without asking what it was. She did not name the melody. Some things lived better unnamed. That night, she wrote nothing, said nothing, but when she placed her head down to sleep, she let herself feel it. Not happiness, exactly. Not peace, but authorship. The slow, joyful weaving of self into place. Her dreams were quieter now. No more corridors that led nowhere. No more rooms full of faces she could not reach. Instead, she dreamed of washing cloth in clear water, of threading needle through fabric, of rooms with open windows. When she woke, her breath was steady. The pouch beside her bed no longer needed to be clutched. It only needed to be present. A symbol, not a lifeline. Her old world had not vanished. It had simply stopped defining her. She rose and opened the shutters to greet the morning, not as a guest in a stranger's house, but as someone who had begun, in silence and shadow, to become part of the foundation. It was nearly a month now since she had entered this life, not just the house, but the shape it required of her. Time had loosened its grip around her throat. She no longer counted mornings. She no longer watched the door for signs of return or departure. Instead, she began to notice other things. The way the older boy had started to whistle when he carried water from the well. The way her husband now wiped his boots before stepping inside, even when the mud had already dried. The way the wind no longer sounded like something trying to get in. These things were not spoken aloud. In this house, affection came in adjustments, not declarations. But still, she felt it, a presence growing in the silence. That week, she decided to clean the loft. It had sat untouched since her arrival, a low-beamed space filled with dust, broken tools, old fabrics. She spent the better part of a day dragging baskets into the light, sorting what could be mended, what could be burned, what might one day be useful again. In the far corner, beneath a layer of woven cobwebs, she found a box of letters wrapped in twine, none addressed to her, none in any familiar hand. She didn't read them. She simply dusted the box and returned it to the corner, this time covered with cloth instead of neglect. Some things were not hers to open, but she had seen them now, and the house, sensing that, seemed to breathe easier. That evening, she swept the floor with more intention, not because it was dirty, but because it had borne witness. Her husband came in late, eyes heavy with the weight of the plow. She handed him broth without speaking. He took it, drank slowly, and when finished, said her name, her actual name, for the first time since their wedding. Just her name, no request attached. She looked up. He looked back. And though neither smiled, something settled between them like a quiet agreement. Not a bond, not yet, but an acknowledgement. She was no longer just filling a role. She was being seen. That night, she sat by the fire after the boys had gone to bed. She took out her pouch and added something new, a button from the boy's old tunic, a sprig of dried clover she had picked on her way back from the well. These were not tokens of who she had been. They were pieces of who she was becoming. Her story was no longer told in thresholds and dowries. It was unfolding here, in dusted corners and shared soup and silence broken just enough to let her name pass through. The fire cracked gently in the hearth. She leaned back against the stone wall and closed her eyes. She wasn't home yet, but she had stopped trying to remember the way back. The first snowfall came without warning. One morning the trees were bare and brittle under a gray sky, and by dusk the branches held a softness they had forgotten. Snow fell slowly, without sound, as though trying not to interrupt. She stood at the doorway and watched it, arms folded over her shawl, the cold brushing her cheeks like a question. The boys ran past her with excitement, tumbling into the yard and throwing handfuls of snow into the air. She didn't call after them. She let them have their joy. Inside, she lit the hearth earlier than usual, kneading dough beside the flames, watching the way the heat curled around the walls. She added a pinch of crushed bay leaf to the stew, not because the recipe asked for it, no one had given her recipes, but because it reminded her of her aunt's kitchen and of the smell that once meant a visitor was coming. That evening, the house was warmer than usual. Her husband lingered at the table longer than he needed to. The boys leaned close to the fire, cheeks flushed. She poured them each a small cup of cider, one she had boiled with clove and bark, the way her mother used to on cold nights. "What's that smell?" the younger boy asked, his voice thick with curiosity. "It's called clove," she said. "It warms the breath." He nodded solemnly, as if he'd been entrusted with something sacred. And perhaps he had. When the boys had gone to bed and the fire was nearly down to embers, her husband stood to leave the room, then paused. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, not with suspicion, but genuine interest. "From where I came," she said. He looked at her for a moment as though realizing for the first time that her past was not something she had shed, but something she carried, woven into her fingers, her food, her quiet decisions. He didn't ask more. He simply nodded, then said, "It's good." That was enough. That night, as snow thickened against the roof, she took out her pouch and held it open in the dim light. She looked at each item slowly. The lavender, now faded to gray, the spoon, its edge worn smooth from use, the button, the scrap of cloth, and now a few cloves tucked in beside the dried herb. Not as a keepsake, as a mark, a sign that her presence here was no longer invisible. She was not simply learning to belong, she was beginning to transform. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, undeniable ways that only a home can notice. She folded the pouch closed, set it beside her bed, and lay down with a quiet breath. The snow pressed gently against the windows. The fire hissed once and slept. And for the first time since her wedding day, she dreamed not of where she had come from, but of where she might be going. It was during a morning thaw, when the frost cracked in long veins across the water barrels, that she first heard the older boy retell a story she had once shared. He was sitting on the bench with his brother, whittling a stick into a dull toy sword, and without prompting, he spoke. "She says clove warms the breath. That's why we drink it when it snows." His voice carried casually, without performance, but she heard it from the kitchen and stopped moving for a moment. Not because it was surprising, but because it was the first time something of her had passed into the house without her touch, a memory that no longer belonged only to her. That evening, the boys asked for the clove cider again. This time, she let them help. They crushed the bark beneath stones and dropped the spices into the pot, watching the water swirl and change. She let them stir, and when it boiled, she cupped their small hands with the warm mugs like she was handing them a piece of weather they could hold. Her husband returned late and took his cup wordlessly. But this time, he waited at the table until she sat, and they drank together, not as husband and wife in any romantic sense, but as two people who had begun to hold their silences differently. She looked at his hands. They were rough, darkened by cold and soil, but steady. She knew now that he had his own pouch of memories, though he would never show them. His griefs were folded, stitched deep beneath his skin, but she could see the seams if she looked closely enough. That night she mended a tear in the boy's tunic by firelight, using the very last scrap of cloth from her dowry chest. She didn't hesitate. The cloth had done its duty. It had brought her here. Now, it could stay. When she was done, she held the tunic up to the firelight, examining her stitches. They were not perfect, but they would hold. She set the garment aside and glanced out the window. The snow had begun to melt, revealing bits of the old ground again. Not the soft green of spring, not yet, but the dull brown promise beneath the ice. She liked that color. It was honest. The next morning she took her pouch and buried one clove by the front step, pressing it into the soil with her thumb. It would not grow, not in this cold. But that was not the point. It was a marker. A quiet flag staked in the earth of her new life. Something only she would remember, and perhaps one day, someone else might discover. Maybe a child digging for stones. Maybe no one. But she would know. She had planted something. And that meant she had not just survived here. She had arrived. It began with the smallest things. A boy reaching for her hand without thinking. Her husband returning with firewood before she asked, the hens settling in her presence instead of scattering. No one announced the change, but it was there, like a draft that had vanished or a leak that had been sealed. The air inside the house simply moved more gently. She started to notice how the boys echoed her habits, rinsing the bowls before eating, folding cloth without being asked, waiting for her nod before taking the last piece of bread. Not because she demanded it, but because it had become the rhythm. Even her husband had altered. He didn't speak more, but he lingered longer, at the table in the doorway beside the barn after sunset. One night he asked if the herbs she used could help with sleep. She made a tea. He drank it without comment, but the next night he asked again. She never told him what was in it. He never asked. In that silence was something close to trust. One morning she found the younger boy trying to imitate her stitching. He had taken one of her older aprons and a dull needle and had sewn a crooked pattern of X's across the edge. When he saw her notice, he looked up with a mixture of fear and pride. "It's for you," he said, eyes darting away. She took the apron gently, turned it in her hands, and said, "Then I'll wear it." She did. That evening. The stitches scratched her side a little, but she didn't care. That night, she took out her pouch and added a thread from the boy's project. The color was uneven, the fabric frayed, but it belonged now. It belonged to her story. She no longer looked at the pouch with longing. Now, she looked at it the way one looks at an old path, familiar, steady, a reminder of where the road began. And yet the road itself had changed. The turns were no longer unfamiliar. The land no longer looked borrowed. She found herself humming again while she worked, sometimes even when someone else was in the room. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't hide. And when the boys joined in, out of tune and laughing, she didn't stop them. She let the sound fill the house, let it push against the ceiling and curl into the corners. Later, when the house was dark and the fire low, she lay awake not from fear, but from thought. She no longer dreamed of returning to her old life. That door had closed, not with sorrow, but with finality. She belonged to no one's story now. Not the girl she had been, nor the wife she had been shaped to become. She was herself. And that was finally enough. The word love was never spoken in the house. It had no place among the chores, the splinters, the aching knees. But it lived there anyway, unspoken, moving quietly through the daily patterns. She saw it in the way her husband started leaving her the best cut of meat without ceremony, setting it in the bowl before the boys even noticed. She saw it in how the older boy began to stand between his brother and the doorway when the wind howled through at night, not as a hero, just as someone who had learned what it meant to guard what he could. These were not grand acts. They were repetitions, offerings laid down in silence, and she gave them too. She mended the hole in her husband's cloak without telling him, folded the boys' tunics with the seams perfectly lined, began leaving a candle stub by the hearth for whoever rose first. No one asked for these things, but they became expected, needed, trusted. And trust, she was learning, could be a kind of love all its own. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed and the house had gone still, her husband came to sit beside her by the fire. He didn't bring work. He didn't bring a question. He just sat. For a long time, they said nothing. The flames moved low and slow, and the silence stretched between them like a shared coat. Then softly he said, "You make the house quiet." At first, she thought he meant it as a critique, but then he added, "It's been loud since my first wife died." She looked at him. He wasn't crying. He wasn't broken open. He was simply tired, honest. She didn't answer. She only reached for the kettle and poured 2 cups. They drank them slowly, and when he left for bed, he touched her shoulder, briefly, like checking for warmth in stone. She didn't move. She didn't have to. That night, she opened her pouch and added nothing. Instead, she emptied it onto her lap. The spoon, the thread, the cloth, the scrap of parchment, the clove. She turned each piece in her hand like a prayer. They weren't magic, but they were proof that she had lived more than one life, that she had arrived, been changed, and still remained herself. She packed them away again, but more gently now, as if the story inside them had begun to deepen. When she blew out the candle, the dark wasn't sharp. It was soft, like wool. She lay down without gripping her shawl, without needing to whisper names into the silence. For once, she fell asleep not remembering, but imagining, not what had been, but what might still become. She hadn't thought of her mother in some time, not fully. The image would return in flashes, the swing of her braid, the way her hands smelled of mint and smoke, the quiet rhythm of her voice while spinning flax at twilight. But these memories came like light through a cracked shutter. They illuminated, but they didn't warm. Then one morning, as she stood by the well, pouring water into the trough, she remembered something in full. The sound of her mother's laugh. Not loud or joyous, but brief, shaped like a secret. It had come after her father said something dry and quiet by the fire. A small laugh, unguarded, folded into the space between them like a leaf into bread dough. She had forgotten that sound. Now it returned without warning, and it nearly broke her. She set the bucket down and walked back inside without finishing. In the corner of the house where the light barely reached, she sat with her pouch and held it open. The contents were the same, but suddenly they didn't feel like anchors. They felt like pages, not of a story she had left behind, but one she still carried. She added a new item, a thin curl of straw, left over from the braid she'd taught the younger boy to weave. Then she closed it, tied the string twice, and set it back down. That afternoon, she made a stew with thyme. Her mother had used thyme only in winter, and only when guests came. She didn't say why, but the scent filled the house now like a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The boys remarked on it. Her husband paused after the first spoonful and asked if it was special. "No," she said, "just old." They nodded, accepting that as enough, and maybe it was. That night she sat outside after the others had gone to bed, the cold curling under her sleeves. She didn't shiver. She let it settle, let it remind her that being alive was not just about comfort. It was also about memory and the things we carry even when we no longer speak them. She whispered her mother's name, not for the dead, but for the living. To remind herself that laughter and pain were not separate things. They were siblings. That same evening, the wind picked up and shook the shutters. Her husband stirred in the next room but didn't rise. She did. She walked to the window, pressed the latch back into place, and held her hand to the wood. For once, she didn't feel the draft in her chest. Only the wood's steadiness. Only its long, slow holding. She returned to bed and didn't reach for her pouch. She didn't need to. The memories had already settled, not into grief, but into shape. The first thaw brought with it a strange unease. The snow receded into patches, leaving behind wet earth and broken stalks. The trees dripped like they were remembering how to speak. And in the village, people began to emerge from their homes again, slower, older somehow, with the eyes of those who had survived a long silence. She walked with the boys to market for the first time since her wedding. It was not far, just beyond the bend where the path met the old road. But the journey felt like a crossing. She wore her older shawl, the one without embroidery, and kept her face half turned from strangers. Still, eyes followed her, not out of malice, but curiosity. Women she didn't know tilted their heads slightly in greeting. A few men nodded to her husband and then to her, like marking the edge of a new boundary. No one asked her name. No one asked if she was happy. But she felt something in their glances, not pity, but placement. She had arrived, and the village had begun to allow her space. She bought onions and oats, bartered a bit of cloth for honey. The boys ran ahead and returned with dirt on their hands and stories about a goose that had chased them. She smiled, not because the story was funny, but because it felt like something normal, something that might be told again next winter. On the way home, her husband carried the heavy sack without being asked. He did not speak, but he walked slightly closer than usual. And once, when the younger boy slipped on a patch of wet stone, her husband reached out first. She followed behind, watching the curve of his back, the strength of his arm, the way the boy grabbed it without thinking. She remembered suddenly how her father had once carried her over a flooded road, his arms wrapped tight across her ribs, his breath in her ear. That memory made her throat close for a moment, not with pain, with distance. It was no longer sharp, just old. That night she wrote her mother's name in the dirt beside the hearth, just once, then wiped it away. Not in secrecy, but in ceremony. The pouch remained closed that night. She didn't need to open it. She no longer needed proof. The walls of the house held her now. The village did not love her, but it recognized her, and that in a world like this was a kind of survival that most women never got to feel. She curled beneath the blanket and let the sounds of the thaw drip through the thatch. A new season was beginning, and she, for the first time, was not afraid of it. The thaw brought mud and birdsong, and with it, a question she had never dared to ask before. Who was she now, without the weight of becoming someone else? For weeks her role had been clear: wife, mother, housekeeper, silence keeper. But as the earth softened and the world stretched again into color, she began to feel the stirrings of something older, something nameless. One afternoon, while the boys were out with their father, she walked to the edge of the woods, past the place where the watermill creaked and the moss grew thick on the stones. She sat beneath a tree and pulled a strip of linen from her pocket. It was not from her dowry. It was something she had woven herself during the long winter nights, piece by piece, learning again what her hands could make. She began to embroider a single line across the edge. Not a name, not a symbol, just a pattern. A slow curve, a turning loop, a stitch shaped like breath. It wasn't meant for anyone else. She wasn't sewing to be admired. She was simply remembering what it felt like to create something not born of need. When she returned home, no one asked where she'd gone, but the boys noticed the thread on her fingers. "Did you make something?" the younger one asked. She nodded. "Not yet, but I started." That night, she pulled her pouch from beneath the bed and took out the oldest piece inside, the broken brooch from her wedding dress. She turned it in her palm, tracing the jagged edge. It no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a relic. A piece from a beginning, not a burden from before. She set it on the windowsill and left it there. Not to forget, but to let it breathe. Her husband saw it the next morning and said nothing, but he didn't move it. In this house, silence was the closest thing to permission. Over the next few days, she began to spend more time outside. Not in escape, in curiosity. She walked the perimeter of the yard, gathered stones, pressed seeds into soil, not because it was expected, but because she wanted to. She began to whistle again while she worked, and one morning the older boy whistled back. Their melodies didn't match, but they didn't need to. The sound itself was a thread, a joining. That evening, after the bread was cooled and the fire stoked, she sat by the window and watched the trees bend in the wind. She did not think of who she had been. She did not think of who she was supposed to be. For the first time, she just let herself be still. Not as a girl, not as a wife, not even as a mother. Just as herself. That, she realized, might be the rarest kind of freedom. The days grew longer. The sun warmed the stones beside the house, and the boys left their boots by the door without being told. Morning no longer felt like a test, just a beginning. She rose early, not out of dread, but habit, because her body now knew the rhythm of this place. The bread had learned her hands, the herbs, her preferences. Even the hens clucked differently when she stepped into the yard. She didn't need permission to move through the day anymore. Her choices were folded into the bones of the house. One afternoon, her husband returned with a sack of wool and said only, "Thought you could use it." She didn't ask where he got it. She only nodded. Later, when the boys were asleep, she carded the wool by firelight, letting the fibers catch the glow of the coals. She found herself humming again. Not an old tune, not one she had been taught, but something made of fragments. A bit of her mother's voice, a line her aunt once sang, the cadence of her own breath on cold mornings. The song had no words, but it belonged to her. The next morning, the younger boy asked her if he could help. She showed him how to twist the fibers, how to separate what was usable from what would scatter in the wind. He listened, lips pursed in concentration, hands clumsy but careful. "Is this what you did before you came here, Saya?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "No, but I wanted to." He didn't ask more, but he remembered. That evening, when her husband sat at the table, the boy said proudly, "She can make thread from nothing." Her husband looked at her, really looked, then nodded. "Good," he said. "That's something." It was the closest he had come to praise. But she didn't need more. The house had learned her name. The floor creaked in familiar places. The light caught on the spoon she had carved. Even the silences now had texture, not emptiness, but presence. She still whispered names some nights, but less often. And when she did, it was more like greeting old friends than trying to hold on. Her pouch remained by the bed, but unopened. It was no longer a lifeline. It was a keepsake. One evening, she placed her hand on the windowsill where the broken brooch still sat. She left it there. It could stay as long as it wanted. Like her. She no longer wondered what might have been if the marriage had never come. The girl she had been was not erased. She was folded in, stitched into the quiet, humming thread of a life still being written. Not perfect, not easy, but hers. They came on a Wednesday, just as the sun had begun to lean toward its late spring arc. A distant cousin and his new wife, travelers by necessity more than pleasure, carrying news from another village and a cartload of odds for trade. She hadn't seen a new face in months. The sound of voices at the gate startled the hens and sent the boys running to the window. Her husband stood, wiped his hands on his tunic, and nodded for her to join. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an order either. It was something else. A gesture of acknowledgement. She stepped outside with her shawl pulled tight and offered bread while the visitors were still dismounting. The cousin looked older than his years, and his wife had a nervous smile that reminded her too closely of her own from that first week. They sat by the fire that evening and shared a meal of lentils and hard cheese. The cousin spoke mostly to her husband, trading names of harvesters and rumors about wolves in the northern woods. But once the young wife turned to her and whispered, "Do you like it here?" A simple question, but not a harmless one. She looked at the woman for a moment, saw the strain in her knuckles, the faint purple bruises half concealed by sleeve, and then she answered, "It's mine now. That's what matters." The other woman nodded slowly, almost with relief. They didn't speak of it again. But after the meal, when they stood to wash the dishes, the young wife reached for the cloth before being asked. They scrubbed side by side in silence, the firelight catching their sleeves like they'd both wandered through the same forest and found each other near the edge. That night, her husband didn't ask her thoughts. He only said, "They'll leave in the morning. I'll give them oats for the road." She nodded. "And bread," she said. "They'll need it." In the quiet that followed, he looked up from the hearth and met her eyes. "Thank you," he said. She wasn't sure for what, the bread, the company, the years she'd given quietly, but the words settled like something real. That night, she added nothing to her pouch. But she folded the cloth on the table with precision, smoothed every wrinkle, then laid it down as if setting a marker. The girl who had once arrived here with nothing but thread and silence had given another woman a reason to breathe softer. That meant something. That meant the world she now lived in was no longer confined to the walls of this house. It was a small orbit, yes, but it had gravity, and she was at its center. The next morning, after the guests had gone and the boys were feeding the hens, she stepped outside with a bowl of scraps and found herself looking at the path they had taken, the ruts of the cart still pressed into the wet soil. She traced them with her eyes, feeling not envy or grief, but something gentler. The road no longer called to her the way it once had. She didn't need to follow it, but she could still look. That evening, while the boys dozed by the fire, she unfolded a piece of cloth she'd been storing beneath the chest. It wasn't for mending. It was blank. The first truly unused thing she'd had in months. She smoothed it over her lap and thought, what would I make if no one was watching? She hadn't asked herself that in years. Maybe never. The question made her chest feel wide and unfamiliar, like a door she didn't know she'd been keeping closed. She didn't start stitching right away. Instead, she lit a second candle and let the room fill with that honey-colored glow, the kind that makes even old wood look new. She sat with the cloth, hands quiet in her lap, as if waiting for it to speak first. Later, her husband entered and saw her sitting there, not working, just thinking. He didn't ask. He only said, "The boys are sleeping hard tonight." She nodded. They played like they didn't know the ground could be dry again. He gave a quiet laugh. Neither did I. There was no expectation in his voice, no weight. He stepped back into the other room and left her with the quiet. For the first time, it felt like space, not absence. That night, she opened her pouch. She took everything out. One by one, she placed the items on the table. The spoon, the thread, the button, the clove, the parchment scrap, the embroidered linen, the bit of straw. Then she did something she had never done before. She spoke to them aloud. Not a prayer, not a ritual, just a naming. "You brought me here," she said, touching each in turn, "and you kept me." Then she folded them back inside and tied the pouch closed. She didn't put it back in the chest. She hung it on a nail beside the window where the light would hit it each morning. A marker, not of loss, of endurance. She was not the same woman who had first crossed that threshold, But she hadn't disappeared either. She had grown. Like a seed pushed into winter soil, she had cracked open, reshaped, reached. Not up, not out, just deeper. Into herself. Into the house. Into the quiet world she had learned not just to survive, but to shape. Spring came fully now, not with a trumpet, but a slow, constant thaw. The trees pushed green buds from their branches, and the earth smelled of waking. The boys returned from the woods each day with hands full of small, wild treasures, snail shells, bird feathers, stones with unusual colors. She started keeping a bowl on the table just for these things, not because they were useful, because they mattered. Her husband noticed. He didn't say anything, but one day he dropped a curled bit of bark into the bowl and walked away. She smiled into her apron. These were the languages they spoke now, not sentences, gestures. One afternoon, she walked to the edge of the field where the soil was warmest. She brought seeds, not for crops, but flowers. Someone had once told her they wouldn't survive in this region. She didn't care. She planted them anyway. Kneeling in the soft dirt, hands steady, breath even, she pressed them into the ground like prayers that didn't need to be answered, only spoken. Behind her, she could hear the boys calling to each other, arguing about nothing important. Their voices rose and fell like the wind. That evening, after the fire had burned low, she sat by the window and watched the moon pull silver over the yard. The pouch still hung beside her, but she no longer looked to it for reassurance. It was no longer a lifeline. It was a witness, a quiet record of the girl who had arrived and the woman who had stayed. Her husband came to sit beside her, not out of routine, but choice. He handed her a wooden comb, freshly carved, rough at the edges, but careful. "It's not much," he said, "but it's something." She took it gently and turned it in her hand. "Thank you," she said. It was more than something. It was a piece of him, offered without demand. She added it to the bowl with the other small things: bark, feather, stone. That night she slept without dreams, not because she had none, because the waking world finally felt like enough. She no longer counted the days since her wedding. She no longer flinched at the sound of the door. She had built something here. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And for the first time, she didn't wonder what life might have been like somewhere else. She only wondered what it might become here in the small house with the uneven floor, the boys who no longer needed to be told twice, the husband who was beginning to listen, and the garden she had planted for no reason other than her own. It was an ordinary day, the kind that left no trace on a calendar. The sun was gentle, the sky undecided between gray and blue. She woke before the boys and moved through the kitchen barefoot, the floorboards cool under her soles. There was no urgency, no ceremony, just the sound of her own breath and the soft clatter of the spoon against the bowl as she stirred the morning oats. The house was still, and in that stillness, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: ease, not joy, not relief, just a quiet fullness. The boys tumbled in, yawning and half-dressed, and she caught herself smiling before they even spoke. Her husband followed with kindling under one arm and a splinter in his finger. She pulled it out without being asked, wrapped his hand with linen, and went on with the day. That was how love lived here now. In the pause, the glance, the unseen reaching. After the morning chores, she went to the stream to wash the linens. The water was still cold, but it didn't bite the way it had in winter. It welcomed. She scrubbed slowly, not out of laziness, but attention. She liked the way the fabric changed under her hands, the way the stains gave way, the rhythm of it all. Across the water, she saw another woman from the village, older, with silver in her braid, and a face shaped like stone and weather. The woman didn't wave, but she nodded, and that was enough. On her way home, she gathered wild greens, tucking them into the folds of her apron. She stopped by the garden, brushed dirt from the seeds she had planted weeks ago. Still no sprout, but she wasn't disappointed. She hadn't planted them for reward. She had planted them to prove she could. That evening, while the boys chased each other in circles, she returned to the cloth she had left unfinished. She stitched a spiral, slow, deliberate, almost meditative. She didn't know what it would become. It didn't matter. It was hers. When her husband came in, his boots muddy and his expression unreadable, he looked at her hands moving and asked, "What are you making?" She looked up and said, "A thing." He nodded and didn't press. That was love too, not demanding an explanation for every quiet joy. That night before she went to bed, she stood by the window and looked out over the yard. It was dark but not silent. The crickets had returned. The wind moved through the grass like a hand through hair. And for the first time, she felt no need to narrate her life to herself. No need to justify it. No need to grieve it. She had done enough. She was enough. The house breathed around her, and she breathed with it. It started with a knock. Not loud, not frantic, but enough to still the room. They weren't expecting anyone. Her husband set down his mug and rose slowly, as if the motion itself required thought. She stood too, wiping her hands on her apron, the boys watching in quiet mimicry. The door opened to reveal a man she didn't know. Dusty boots, cloak patched at the shoulders, a scroll tucked into his belt, and a pouch at his side. He didn't look dangerous. He looked tired. "Message from the magistrate," he said simply, and handed the scroll over. Her husband read it in silence, lips pressed to a line. When he finished, he passed it to her without a word. The words were neat, formal, but the meaning was clear. A census. The king's men would be arriving within the month to count every soul, assess every holding, and record the value of each dwelling. Taxes would follow. Perhaps more. She set the scroll down without reacting. Her heart had tightened, but her face did not show it. "We've weathered worse," her husband said. She nodded, though she wasn't so sure. The arrival of authority, even distant, always sent cracks through the walls of a quiet life. That night, the boys asked what it meant. She told them gently that they would need to tidy, to prepare, to be ready for men with boots and eyes that looked too hard at things. "Will they take anything?" the younger one asked. "Only what we owe," she said. It was the best lie she could manage. The next morning, she began to prepare. She mended curtains, scrubbed the doorstep, hid the pouch deeper in her chest. The seeds she had planted would be just sprouting by the time they came. Too fragile to protect themselves. But she left them in the soil anyway. She couldn't stop their growth just to make the world safer. That evening, her husband helped patch the roof without being asked. He didn't speak much, but his presence was heavier than usual, as if the weight of unseen things had pressed closer. At dinner, no one talked about the scroll, but every clatter of the bowl seemed louder, every creak of the chair more meaningful. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, she stood outside for a long time, watching the wind press against the trees. The world had grown wide again, not in a good way, but she did not feel small. Not this time. She wrapped her shawl tighter and whispered to the dark, "We are here." A statement, a vow. And as she turned to go back inside, she glanced at the garden. Still nothing blooming. But the ground had split, just slightly, to make room. The days that followed passed like smoke, visible but impossible to hold. Each morning brought a new layer of preparation, and each night a silence that hung heavier over the table. They didn't speak often of the visit to come, but it was in every movement. Her husband stacked firewood too neatly. The boys scrubbed their boots without being told. She cleaned the chest beneath the bed, not to hide what was inside, but to understand what she still carried. The pouch was there, untouched. She ran her fingers across the cloth and closed it again. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. By midweek, the garden finally split open with the green tips of the first sprout. Just one. It was crooked, a little pale, and so new it looked like it might still decide whether or not to live. She knelt beside it, didn't touch it, just whispered a quiet breath into the space around it. "You're here," she said, and that was enough. Later that day, a neighbor passed by. He didn't stop, just raised a hand. But it was the first time someone had acknowledged her alone, not her husband. It startled her and pleased her. She was beginning to be known, not just absorbed. That evening, she took out the embroidery again. Not the spiral, a new cloth. She began stitching a border, careful, deliberate, one thread at a time. It was not meant for trade. It was not meant for praise. It was a frame, a way to claim space. Her husband noticed. "Starting something new?" he asked. "No," she said. "Finishing what I meant to do months ago." He said nothing, but later she saw he'd laid the comb he carved at the center of the table beside the bowl of feathers and stones, a quiet offering, a weight shared. That night the air was cool again, the season undecided. She stood by the window and watched the stars flicker, not sharp, but soft. She didn't fear the king's men, not the way she once might have. Their arrival would rattle the house, yes, but they would not undo what had been built here. She had roots now. Not deep, but real. And even if the garden failed, even if they took more than promised, even if the quiet was pierced, she would remain. The world outside might always bring disruption, but inside, she had stitched something steady. The house wasn't hers by law, but it knew her shape now. And that in this century, for a woman like her, was a kind of revolution. They came on horseback, their cloaks heavy with dust, the sound of hooves announcing them long before the knock. The boys froze. Her husband stood. She smoothed her apron, wiped her palms once on her skirt, and moved toward the door before anyone else could. 3 men, one older, holding a ledger, 2 younger, eyes scanning everything like hawks. "Household head?" the older one asked. Her husband stepped forward, nodding. "Name, holdings, dependents," the man said, already writing. No greeting, no kindness, just duty. She didn't speak unless addressed, but her eyes missed nothing. She watched the way the younger guards glanced over the furniture, the walls, the garden through the window. They weren't cruel, just trained to see what they could take. It was her job to make sure they found little. Her husband answered with short, honest replies. She appreciated that. Embellishment would invite suspicion. Simplicity was their best defense. "And the woman?" the older man asked. Her husband said her name. Just her name. No titles. No explanations. She met the scribe's eyes, held them a breath longer than necessary. He looked away first. That was something. The questions continued. Land boundaries, livestock, number of tools, whether any family had come or gone. "No arrivals," her husband said, "and no births." She saw the pause in the man's hand, a note of disappointment. New life was taxable. Emptiness was easier. They moved through the rooms without asking. She followed behind, not as a guide, but a shadow. When one paused near the chest, she said calmly, "Linens. You're welcome to count them." The guard hesitated, then moved on. She didn't breathe again until they left the room. The pouch, buried deep beneath those linens, remained untouched. An hour passed. They took no coin. only names, promises, a warning that collectors would follow come autumn. When the men finally turned to leave, the oldest said, "Well-kept place, orderly." Her husband said nothing, but she inclined her head slightly, just enough to accept the remark without receiving it. As the horses pulled away, the boys began to speak again, all at once, laughter, nervous relief, mimicry of the soldiers' stiff voices. Her husband went to chop wood without a word, but she stayed by the window a long time, watching the dust settle on the road. The house felt quieter, not because it had been violated, but because it had endured. They had come, looked, taken nothing, and left. The silence they left behind was different than before. It was not fear, it was strength. That night, as she brushed ash from the hearth, she whispered to the coals, "You see, we bent, but we did not break." And the fire, low and red, seemed to nod. The days that followed passed in a kind of quiet that was not stillness, but recovery. The boys returned to their games. Her husband resumed his work, more silent than before, but not withdrawn. He had faced the officials and answered without shame. That counted for something. She moved through the house with a sharper awareness now. Every object had been measured in someone else's ledger, but none of them truly seen. And that, in a strange way, gave her comfort. The house was still hers, not by law or deed, but by use, by memory, by care. She went to the garden again. The sprouts had pushed further, little green mouths reaching for the sun. She knelt and ran her finger along the edge of the leaves. "You're not afraid," she whispered. "So neither am I." She harvested early greens and brought them inside. That evening's meal tasted different, not richer, but earned. Even the boys seemed to chew slower, as if their bodies knew something important had passed. After the meal, she sat by the window and stitched again, this time adding a row of tiny marks along the border, one for each day since the king's men had come. A ritual, a kind of spell. Not to forget, but to contain. Her husband passed by and said, "It was good what you made." She looked up. "The food?" "No, the feeling. After." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, she began to find herself waking before the light. Not out of worry, out of habit, out of rhythm. The morning felt like hers now. Before the boys stirred, before the fire was stoked, before the chores began, she stood in the yard, barefoot, and watched the sky change. It never changed fast, but it always changed, and that was enough. One morning, she brought her pouch outside with her. She sat on the step and opened it slowly, laying each piece out in a line. The spoon, the button, the parchment, the comb, the thread, the cloth, the feather, the bark. She held them all, then placed them back, not carefully, but confidently. They no longer felt like memories. They felt like tools, proof not just of what she had lived through, but what she had built with the pieces. That afternoon, she began planning for winter. It was far off, but planning ahead had become part of how she survived, not with fear, but with intention. She made a list in her mind, stores to gather, wood to split, thread to dye. But alongside that list was another, new things she wanted to try. She was no longer waiting for the world to tell her who she must be. She was starting to ask it, who else could I become? It began with a loaf of bread. She had made 2 that morning, out of habit, out of rhythm, and found herself staring at the second one like it had no place. The house was already full. The boys would eat their share, her husband his, and she hers. But this second loaf sat too still, as if waiting to be carried. So she wrapped it in cloth, tied it with thread from her pouch, and walked the narrow path to the house at the edge of the village, the one with the woman who had nodded at the stream weeks before. She knocked once, then again, heart strangely loud in her ribs. The door opened. The woman didn't smile, but she stepped aside. The room behind her smelled like dried onions and wool. She held out her hands. "I wasn't expecting anyone," she said. "Then it's a good thing I didn't bring news," she replied. "Just bread." The woman blinked, then stepped back to let her in. They sat without ceremony. They ate without talk. It wasn't a visit. It was a sharing. Something older than language. When she returned home, she didn't explain where she'd gone. Her husband looked up and noticed the empty cloth. "They like it?" he asked. "I think so," she said. That night, she sat by the hearth and stared into the flames. There was a strange strength in having given something away. Not as obligation, not as barter, as gift. And gifts in a world like this made people remember you. A few days later, she received a spool of dyed thread left on her doorstep. No note, just placed there, visible, deliberate. She didn't have to ask. She knew. That week, she brought extra greens to the woman with the hollow eyes who had buried her third child last winter. No one said a word about the past. They didn't need to. Each small act was a new thread in a net being woven, not to catch, but to hold. These women, once strangers, now shared something beyond proximity. They shared silence. They shared survival. She began to walk with her head a little higher, not because she expected thanks, but because she now knew her place was not behind anyone. It was beside. The boys noticed too. One morning, the younger asked, "Why do people wave at you now?" She smiled. "Because I wave first." That night, she added a final stitch to the border of her embroidery, a knot, not to close it, but to mark the middle. She wasn't done, not even close. But she had reached the part of the story where the character begins to choose, and that, she thought, might be the real beginning after all. It happened on a rain-soaked morning, the kind where the light never fully arrives. She was sweeping ash from the hearth when her husband entered, boots wet, hair dripping, holding a small bundle wrapped in linen. He didn't say anything, just placed it on the table and stepped back. Inside was a bundle of dried herbs, thyme, marjoram, a sprig of something that still held scent despite the weather. "I saw it on the edge of the wood," he said. "Thought maybe you could use it." She looked at the bundle, then at him. The moment passed without a smile, but something deeper moved beneath it. That evening, after the boys had gone quiet and the wind rattled the shutters, they sat near the hearth, the two of them, not speaking, not planning, just present. She turned the comb he had carved weeks before over in her hands. It was still rough at the edges, but it worked. She began to use it without thinking. He watched. "I can smooth it," he said. She paused. "No need. I like things that take time to fit." He nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. He didn't reach for her. That was not their way. But when she rose to bank the fire, he stood as well and brought more wood before she could ask. They moved around each other without conflict now. There was still silence, still caution. But it no longer felt like distance. It felt like respect. That night he asked if she wanted the lamp left burning. She looked at him for a moment. "No, I know where everything is." And she did. She knew the slope of the floor near the stove, the creak of the second step, the way the light filtered through the thatch in the morning. This was not the house she would have chosen, but it had become hers, and in it her husband had slowly become more than a presence, not yet a companion, not yet a friend, but no longer a stranger. They were building something that looked, from the outside, like an ordinary life, but she knew how rare it was, how hard won, and how unfinished. That night, before sleep, she touched the nail beside the window where her pouch still hung. Then she let her hand fall away. There was no need to open it. The things she had hidden in it no longer needed guarding. They had already done their work. The rain continued through the night, soft and steady. And for the first time in a long while, she slept deeply. Not because she was safe, not because she was free, but because she was known. She had not thought of her mother in weeks. Not truly. There had been flashes, a scent, a phrase, the way her hands moved while kneading dough, but nothing sustained. Until the morning she caught her reflection in the window pane. Not a mirror, just glass fogged from the fire. For a moment she saw a face that was not entirely her own. Her mother's eyes, her mother's brow, the way the mouth held silence without apology. She turned away quickly, heart flickering, not from fear, but from recognition. She sat down and pulled her pouch into her lap, opening it slowly. At the very bottom, caught beneath the parchment scrap in the clove, was the thread. Her mother's thread, passed to her in a moment neither of them had expected to be their last. She held it now and whispered, "You didn't prepare me for this." But she said it without anger, just fact. And then softer, "You gave me what you could." That afternoon, while the boys played in the rain-soaked yard and her husband repaired a broken gatepost, she stayed inside and began to weave the thread into her embroidery. Not to hide it, to place it. A single line of pale gold stitched through the center of the spiral she had started weeks ago. It was not decorative. It was structural. A spine. She worked in silence, her fingers steady, her breathing even. This was not tribute. It was connection. When the boys came in, cheeks red and hair dripping, she looked up and smiled, not because they asked her to, but because she wanted to. That night she added dried herbs to their bathwater. Not necessary, just kind. Her husband noticed. "Smells like you're cooking," he said. "Then we must be clean enough to eat," she replied. And he laughed. Actually laughed. A low, surprised sound that startled even him. She found herself laughing too, and for a brief, flickering moment, the room felt lit from within. That night, she placed the embroidery by the window. Let the moonlight touch it. Let the stars see it. She whispered one more thing to the thread, to her mother, to the silence beyond the roof. "I'm not you, but I understand you now." It was not forgiveness. There had been nothing to forgive. Just the unspooling of a life, one thread passed to another. She was no longer the girl who had left home weeping. She was no longer the woman who had arrived in silence. She was something else now. Someone stitched together from memory, choice, and quiet defiance. And that, she thought, might just be the inheritance her mother meant to leave. The heat settled low across the valley, pressing itself into every fold of cloth and creak of timber. It was not unbearable, but constant, like a hand resting on your back to remind you of its presence. The boys grew quieter in the afternoons, their games slowing to hushed arguments beneath the trees. She let them. The world didn't need to be loud to be full. Inside the house, the air moved slow. She kept the windows open even after the sun began to fade, letting the warmth linger on the skin of the walls. Each day, she followed the same quiet circuit: gather, wash, mend, stir. And each day, she found herself doing it with less effort and more intent. Not as duty, not even as habit, as practice, a way of being. Her husband spent more time in the fields now, or in the shed repairing tools. He came back each evening with dust on his face and a word or two about something mundane, a neighbor's broken wheel, a crow that wouldn't leave the grain alone. They were not deep conversations, but they were shared, and that, for now, was enough. One evening, she sat outside alone after everyone had gone to bed. The moon was low, swollen, casting pale light across the yard. She looked out over the garden, the crooked rows, the thin green stalks, the patch where nothing had grown at all, and felt no shame. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. She had made it. She had tended it. And in return, it had taught her something the church had never preached, that patience was not a virtue. It was a survival skill, that sometimes to endure was to win. The next morning, she woke before the light and began boiling water. She made tea with herbs she had dried herself and poured a cup for her husband without being asked. He took it with a simple "thank you" and drank it in silence. But the cup stayed in his hand even after the tea was gone. He held it like something that mattered. That day, she began sewing a second cloth, not another spiral, something new, a border of roots branching out from each corner and meeting at the center. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she would. The thread would tell her in time. That night, she dreamed not of the past, nor of the road not taken, but of the kitchen, the yard, the boys laughing at dusk. And in the dream, she was not watching. She was part of it, moving through it like a person who belonged. She woke with her hands open and her breath steady. Summer would end soon. The harvest would come. But tonight, she was not waiting for the next thing. She was here, fully. The wind came in the night. Not loud, not violent, but certain. It moved through the trees like a messenger and slipped beneath the door with a sigh. By morning, the house felt different. The warmth from the hearth didn't stretch as far, and the boys huddled closer to their bowls at breakfast. She tied her shawl tighter, not because she was cold, but because the world was changing again, and her body remembered what that meant. Leaves had begun to curl at the edges. The grass, once lush and brazen, grew brittle. The sky itself seemed higher somehow, a wider dome with paler light. The harvest was not far off, and the list in her mind grew heavier. But she did not rush. She moved slower now, not from weariness, but from certainty. Every motion had purpose. Every silence had shape. Her husband noticed it too. One morning, while they shelled beans by the window, he said, "We'll need more wood this year." She nodded. The boys are stronger now. They can help. He didn't argue. They had begun to trust each other's judgment without question. That was new. That was earned. She began preparing the pantry, checking jars, drying herbs, setting cloth over baskets. But alongside these tasks, she found herself setting aside things for no reason other than memory. A stone the boys had brought her, a worn comb, a scrap of blue thread she'd once nearly thrown away. She wasn't hoarding. She was marking time. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, she paused and looked out toward the path. The dust had settled there again, but the memory of hooves and ledgers lingered. She didn't fear their return, not anymore, but she knew the world was never done testing. That evening, she placed her embroidery in the chest, not because it was finished, but because she wanted to preserve what it had already become. The roots she'd sown had begun to curve toward each other at the center, like hands reaching without needing to touch. She would return to it when the time was right. That night, the wind returned, stronger this time. It rattled the shutters and made the boys stir in their sleep. She lit a candle, not for light, but for comfort, and sat by the fire until it was calm again. Her husband came to sit beside her, knees close, silence easy. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Outside, the world was changing. Inside, it held. And for the first time in many seasons, she wasn't preparing for disaster. She was preparing for continuity, for a life not just endured, but sustained. The first frost touched the ground like a whispered warning, delicate but firm. She found it early in the morning, glinting silver across the stones near the garden. The sprouts were gone now, the vines brittle, the soil hardening in its corners. But she didn't grieve it. The garden had done what it could. It had given, and now it was sleeping. She ran a hand over the stalks and whispered thanks. Then she turned back toward the house with a sense of completion, not loss. Inside, the boys were already stirring, sleepy and half-dressed, rubbing their eyes as they shuffled to the fire. She handed them wool socks and bowls of hot grain. Her husband had gone out before dawn to help a neighbor lift barrels of cider into the cart. The harvest was a shared thing now, each house doing its part, each hand counted. Later that day, she joined the women near the granary. They worked without speaking much, threshing, sorting, binding. But there were glances, nods, the occasional brief laugh that came and went like birds startled from a tree. The woman from the stream handed her a bundle of dried mint with no explanation. She took it with a nod, a gift without ceremony. That evening, the table was heavier than usual. Turnips, beans, boiled oats, a chunk of cheese traded for linen scraps. Her husband lifted his cup in silence, and for a moment they all sat there, the candlelight catching in their faces. She didn't say anything, but inside she marked the moment. This was not celebration. It was acknowledgement. The kind that only happens when a family realizes it is, in fact, a family. After the boys went to bed, she sat by the fire and opened her pouch again. It was smaller now, not in size, but in weight. She'd taken pieces out, given them away, sewn them into cloth, planted them in soil. What remained was essential. Not the story of who she was, the story of who she chose to be. She added a single dried leaf from the garden. Not the first, not the most beautiful. Just one that had lived its season well. She tied the pouch closed, kissed the knot, and hung it back on its nail. Her husband, watching from the doorway, said, "They'll remember this year." She looked up. Who? The boys. Maybe others too. This was the year things held. She didn't answer, but she felt the truth of it settle in her chest like a warm stone. The wind picked up outside, brushing dry leaves against the window pane. She stood and banked the fire, then placed her hand on the wall beside the hearth. Solid, familiar, hers. In the months to come, they would ration, endure, wait. But tonight, there was nothing to fear. The cupboards were full. The boys were asleep. The house was whole. The snow came suddenly, not in flurries, but in a slow, relentless fall that blanketed the rooftops and muffled every sound. She woke to find the world transformed, softened under white, every sharp edge rounded off. Even the air had changed, dense, silent, suspended. The boys pressed their noses to the window and breathed fog onto the panes. Her husband stood at the doorway with arms crossed, scanning the sky like it might offer some warning. But she only looked out and nodded. It was time. The season of movement had ended. Now came the season of staying. The days grew shorter, the light weaker. And yet inside the house, things felt steadier than ever. The boys played in the same corners where, months ago, they had sulked and fought. Her husband spent more time by the fire, carving shapes from scrap wood, birds, animals, sometimes nothing at all. She returned to her embroidery. The second cloth now, almost complete. The roots she'd begun months earlier had reached the center and turned upward. From them, she now stitched small branches, curling delicately into the shape of a tree. Not large, not commanding, but persistent. Growing from the edges inward, refusing to remain hidden. She stitched while the snow fell. She stitched while bread rose, while the boys napped, while the wind howled. It became her measure of time, her anchor. That week, the woman from the stream visited. Not to trade, just to sit. They shared tea and silence. At one point, the woman reached for the embroidery. "Yours?" she asked. "Mine," she said. The woman nodded once, then handed it back. No praise, no critique, just recognition. That evening, she showed it to her husband. He didn't understand the pattern, but he looked at it a long time. "That's from the garden," he said, pointing to the stitch that curled just like the bent sprout they'd nearly lost in spring. She hadn't realized she'd copied it, but she smiled. "Yes, it is." After the boys went to sleep, they sat together without words. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the beams. She found herself leaning slightly toward him, not out of duty, not from cold, from habit. A good one. His hand brushed hers, and she let it rest there. Outside, the snow continued. A world rebuilt in silence. Inside, the walls held, the fire crackled, and she realized something simple and vast. She was no longer waiting to be seen. She was already known, in the ways that mattered, in the house she hadn't chosen, in the life she hadn't asked for. She had grown something lasting. And that, she thought, was a kind of love, whether or not the word had ever been spoken. The nights were longer now, stretched like cloth too thin to hold shape. The fire burned lower each evening, and the house grew still not from sleep, but from pause. The kind of pause that asks you to sit with yourself. She found herself waking in the early hours, not startled, just alert. The others slept deeply. She would rise, wrap herself in wool, and sit by the hearth long after the embers had dimmed. It was in those hours, wrapped in breath and silence, that she began to speak aloud. Not prayers, not confessions, just questions, small ones at first. Where did the girl I was go? What did she believe? Did I carry her here or bury her back there in the fields where I first bled as a wife? The house never answered, but the stillness listened. She would sit with her pouch in her lap, not opening it, just holding it. Not as something sacred, but as something earned. It had changed shape, softened at the corners, like anything kept close long enough. She sometimes imagined the younger girls in the village, the ones now promised, the ones walking where she once did, eyes down, breath held. She wanted to warn them, and she didn't. Because what would she say? That it was hard? That it was quiet? That it was survivable but not fair? Or would she tell them something else? That the hardness becomes shape? That the silence becomes language? That what you build inside yourself cannot be taken, only offered? One morning, as frost veined the window pane, she found herself humming. A tune she hadn't heard in years, something her mother sang once while spinning thread. The sound surprised her. It didn't feel borrowed. It felt returned. Like a part of her had waited, silent, until she was ready to remember it without pain. Later that day, she walked the perimeter of the house, slowly with care, checking beams, testing the roof's edge, brushing snow from the woodpile. Not to find flaws, but to greet what held. Each board, each nail, had a history, and so did she. That night, she lit a candle and wrote a single sentence on a scrap of cloth. "I am still here." Then she stitched it into the lining of her dress, where no one would see. Not hidden, protected. A secret only in the way that breath is a secret, known, constant, and necessary. She no longer needed anyone to name her strength. It was in the way she stood, the way she waited, the way she had learned not to run from silence, but to make it a room she could live in. And in that room, she was not just a wife, not just a mother, not just a girl once chosen. She was herself. The snow had fallen in silence all night, layering the world with a hush so deep it made the floorboards creak like they were afraid to interrupt. She stood early, lit a single candle, and began boiling water for tea. The boys stirred but didn't rise. Her husband came in from the shed, breath misting from his mouth, carrying a stack of firewood that left snow melt on the floor. She watched him shake it off, watched the way he moved without urgency. They had not spoken much in days, nothing wrong, nothing broken, but a quiet had settled between them, like two travelers sharing the same path without asking where the other was headed. As he placed the wood near the hearth, she said, "Sit with me." It wasn't a question. He hesitated only slightly, then obeyed. She poured 2 cups of tea, slid one to him, and let the silence stretch a little longer before breaking it. "Do you ever think about what we would be if we had chosen each other?" He didn't look at her. Not at first. He stared at the steam rising from his cup, then finally met her gaze. "I don't know what I'd be," he said, "but I know I wouldn't be this. Not steady, not quiet." She tilted her head. "Do you regret it?" He thought longer than she expected. "No," he said finally, "but I wish I'd been more curious. I didn't ask what you loved. I asked what you could do." She smiled faintly, surprised at his clarity. "And now?" He shrugged. "I still don't know." "What do you love?" She was quiet. No one had asked in years. The answer didn't come quickly. The way bread smells in winter. The sound of water in a cup. When the boys laugh and forget to be careful. She paused. "Sewing something that doesn't have to be useful, just beautiful." He nodded. "That's enough to know someone by." The fire cracked. Somewhere upstairs, one of the boys coughed in his sleep. She looked at her husband, not as her keeper, not as her protector, not even as her match. Just as someone who, like her, had been shaped more by weather than by wish. She said, "You never told me what you love." He looked up, blinked slowly. "I think I'm learning." They didn't touch. They didn't need to. But something softened in the space between them, not melted, not vanished, just softened like ice on a roof that begins to drip when no one is looking. That night she added a new thread to her embroidery, a deep red one, warm and steady. She stitched it low, near the base of the tree, where the roots met the soil, not as a decoration, as a sign. The snow had slowed, but not stopped. It fell in lazy spirals, softening the outlines of things that once stood sharp, fences, trees, footsteps. She watched from the window as the woman from the stream passed, head low against the cold, a woven basket tucked under one arm. Without thinking, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, leaving the door ajar just long enough for her husband to notice she was gone. The woman paused when she saw her, eyes narrowing. "It's not trade day," she said. "No," she replied, "but I have stitches that want company." The woman raised a brow, then nodded toward her home. They walked together in silence, boots crunching through frost, breath white in the air. Inside, the house was warm, fragrant with lentils and old wood. They sat across from each other near the fire, each pulling out scraps of fabric, baskets of tangled thread, bits of color worn by weather and time. They did not talk about their husbands, or their pasts, or even the war they knew had crept closer in the north. They talked about thread, about how certain colors held better through winter, about how knots could become part of the pattern if placed with intention. By midday, a third woman arrived, then a fourth. No invitation had been sent, but somehow they all arrived with something to offer: cloth, bread, news of a goat born early. The circle widened. Stories flowed in between stitches, dropped and picked up like needles. One woman, older than the rest, told of a girl who had run once, truly run, to escape a match that would have silenced her. She was caught, she said. Of course, but not returned. She was sent to tend the sick, became one of them. The room fell quiet. No judgment. Just the understanding that bravery often ended in someone else's story. That evening, she returned home with a handful of new threads and a mind full of names she would remember. Her husband looked up from the hearth. "You were gone long," he said. "I was where I belonged," she answered gently. He nodded once, and that was the end of it. She sat at the table, began threading her needle with the palest blue she had brought back, a color like thaw. The boys leaned against her elbows as she worked, asking about the stories she'd heard. "Did anyone fight?" the younger one asked. "Yes," she said, "but not with fists." He frowned. "With what then?" She looked down at the thread in her hand. "With staying," she said, "with not being erased." That night, the house felt warmer than the fire could explain. And in her dreams, the tree she had stitched began to bloom. Not with flowers, with faces. The letter came tucked inside a bundle of salt, wrapped in waxed cloth and sealed with twine. It bore no crest, no official mark, just her name, written in a hand she hadn't seen in over a decade. She stared at it for a long time before opening it, hands still dusted from flour, the dough she had been kneading now left to rise. The boys stood watching from the stairs. Her husband kept his distance. He knew something had changed by the way she exhaled before she unfolded the page. The handwriting was clumsy but familiar. Her sister, still living, still calling her by the name only family had used. The message was short, barely 3 sentences, but they carried weight. Their father had died last harvest. Their youngest brother was now a father himself. And there was a place for her if she ever wished to come see the old house, what remained of it. She didn't cry, but the words stayed with her all day, not like a wound, but like a stone warmed in a fire, something old, something real, something still capable of heat. That evening she told her husband, "My sister wrote." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "You've spoken of her." She didn't realize she had, but the memory of small mentions, half sentences, returned. The boys were quiet at dinner, sensing something sacred had entered the room. "Will we go?" the younger asked. She paused. "Not now, but maybe." And it was honest. Not a refusal. Not a promise. Just a space left open for what might be. That night she pulled her embroidery close and began a new ring around the tree. Not roots, not branches, but a border of symbols only she understood. A figure carrying a sack, a river crossing, a house drawn small with a crooked roof, the story of leaving, and the possibility of returning. Her husband sat beside her, watching the thread move through the cloth. "Did you love them?" he asked. "Once," she said. "Maybe still." He nodded, then added, "You've never spoken that name aloud, your own name. She looked at him. Would you like to hear it? Only if you want me to know. She smiled gently and spoke the name, not loud, not soft, but whole. He repeated it once, carefully, then never again. He didn't need to. It wasn't his to carry. But now he knew. And that made something settle inside her. That night, she placed the letter in her pouch. Not hidden, sheltered. A seed, maybe, or a bridge. Either way, it was hers. And for the first time, she slept not as someone surviving her past, but as someone who might one day walk back through it, head high, feet steady, and eyes open. The first drip startled her. It came from the eaves at dawn, a single note of meltwater tapping the stone below. Then another. By midday, the whole roof wept in rivulets. The snow hadn't vanished, but it had begun to recede, pulling back like a curtain to reveal what had been waiting beneath. The ground was still hard, the trees still bare, but something had shifted, and everyone in the house could feel it. The boys were restless in new ways. They asked to go outside even before breakfast. Her husband stood longer at the threshold each morning, watching the light change its color on the hills. She too felt the tremor of it, not excitement, readiness. She opened windows briefly to let in air that smelled of wet earth and thawed bark. The house didn't warm, not yet, but it breathed. That afternoon she returned to the garden. Nothing had grown, of course not, but the earth no longer resisted her. It yielded just slightly beneath her palm. She knelt and pressed her hand into the soil and whispered, "I'm still here, not for the land's sake, for her own." The pouch at her waist felt lighter. She hadn't added to it in weeks, hadn't needed to. The weight that once gave her comfort now seemed unnecessary. But she didn't discard it. She carried it as one might carry a story, not to tell it every day, but to remember how it shaped the listener. Inside, she began reorganizing, not out of boredom, but with intention. She emptied the shelves, cleaned the cloths, rewound spools of thread with fresh tension. The boys helped, half serious, half playful. Her husband reinforced the gate that had sagged through the cold. No one asked why. They all knew what was coming. Not the future, the return, to rhythm, to sun, to decisions. She found herself writing lists again, not for food, not for chores, for dreams, things she might make, places she might visit, people she might send word to. She wrote them slowly, folded the page, and stitched it into the hem of her apron. One evening, while mending a torn sleeve, she asked her husband, "Would you plant another row this year, beyond the fence?" He glanced up. "Why?" She shrugged. "Because I think something might grow there now." He nodded. "Then we will." That night, the fire burned low, but no one added wood. They all sat in the warmth of something else. The knowledge that winter hadn't broken them. It had revealed them. And as the wind softened and the stars reappeared, she understood something she hadn't known to name before, that survival was not the end of the story. It was the middle. The soil didn't bloom because it endured the cold. It bloomed because it remembered how to begin again. The ice was gone from the well, but the water still bit at the skin. She drew it slowly, hand steady, breath calm. The rope creaked with weight, but not struggle. Beside her, the elder boy offered to take the bucket. She handed it to him without comment, and he carried it without spilling. Strength, she noted, did not announce itself. It moved through people like good bread, dense, sustaining, passed from hand to hand. Back inside, she warmed the water and began washing winter from the linens. The basin steamed beside her. She scrubbed in slow circles. Each cloth held the shape of the months they'd survived. Soot at the corners, blood at the edges, tears never spoken of. She didn't try to erase them. She simply made them clean. Later that day, the village messenger passed through, a thin man on a slower horse, shouting news from the roads. Markets reopening. A marriage broker traveling south. A monastery in need of girls who could sing. She listened from a distance. Once, those names would have frozen her: marriage, monastery, market. Now, they barely stirred her pulse. Her life was not behind those doors anymore. It was here, planted, watered, waiting to grow again. That evening, she stitched a name into the hem of the boys' blanket. Not their names, her own. Small, discreet, but legible. So they would know one day who held them through the quietest, hardest season of their lives. Her husband watched her. "You always write," he said, "even when no one will read it." She met his eyes. "That's how I know it's true." The snow hadn't vanished entirely. Patches remained in the shadowed parts of the yard, but the center had cleared, and she began raking the garden bed with long, measured strokes. Each line of soil made her feel taller, not proud, rooted. The women gathered again that week, this time with bundles of seeds saved through frost and hope. They didn't say what they planned to plant. They simply exchanged handsful of promise. Peas, beans, flax, stories. She returned home with her skirt pockets full of both. That night, the fire needed less tending. The boys slept lightly, talking to each other in the dark. Her husband didn't ask questions. He simply placed another chair by the fire, not beside hers, but close enough. She sat. He sat. No one led. No one followed. The silence between them now felt like soil after rain, ready. And for the first time, she said aloud, "When the road opens again, I'll visit her." He nodded. "And if it closes?" She smiled. "Then I'll send something ahead of me. A letter, a scrap, a thread. Whatever she left behind, it would carry her name. Not the one she was given, the one she chose." The first flowers didn't announce themselves. They appeared quietly in the furrows beside the garden wall, in places she hadn't even sown. Pale yellow, like old parchment. Small, fragile, but unmistakable. Life had returned. Not because it was invited, because it insisted. She crouched beside them in the early morning, hands tucked into her sleeves, breath held, as if even noticing them too quickly might drive them back underground. But they remained. She rose and fetched water, not because they needed it, rain had done its part, but as a gesture, a welcome. That same morning, the elder boy brought her a broken egg in his cupped hands. "It didn't survive," he said, "but it tried." She looked down at the mess. A perfect oval split open, a bit of yolk still clinging to the curve. "You tried too," she said gently. "That matters." He seemed surprised by her tone, but he didn't argue. Later that week, she noticed the woman from the stream planting onions near her fence, not in her own yard, in the space between theirs. It wasn't claimed. It wasn't explained. It simply was. A shared seam. A quiet offering. The boys began collecting stones from the path and placing them in a line near the garden's edge. "A wall?" she asked. "A path," they answered. "To where?" They shrugged. "We'll find out." And she didn't press further. That evening, she returned to the embroidery one last time. The tree she'd been stitching all winter was now surrounded by faces, hands, footsteps, animals, seeds. It had become something beyond her. A record, a map. She added one final detail. A thread of white curling from the base of the trunk, winding outward like breath, not to frame it, to free it. Then she folded the cloth, wrapped it in linen, and placed it not in her pouch, but on the shelf, visible, meant to be found. Her husband saw it later and touched the bundle lightly. "For the girls?" he asked. "For anyone who needs to remember." He nodded. "It'll outlive us." She smiled. "That's the point." That night, the air was warm enough to leave the window open. She lay beside him in the dark and listened to frogs, to wind, to the breathing of children who no longer needed to be protected in the same way. And then she whispered, not to him, not to herself, but to the air itself. "I stayed." The word did not sound like resignation. It sounded like truth. And the air answered, not with words, but with the scent of wet soil and something green just beginning to break through. The road to the village looked different now, narrower, perhaps, or maybe she had simply grown. When she walked it, she did so without a shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, without eyes downcast. The same trees leaned over the path, the same stones jutted where they always had. But she saw them now, not as obstacles, but as witnesses. That morning she had tied her apron with the old cloth, the one from her mother, the one she'd nearly thrown away. It had worn soft with years, edges fraying. She touched it absent-mindedly as she walked, a tether between what was and what had become. When she passed the well at the crossroads, she paused. A girl stood there, no more than 14, filling a jar with water. Her hands were chapped, her sleeves too short. They exchanged a nod, nothing more. But the girl watched her as she passed, eyes trailing behind, as if trying to memorize how a woman might move when she is not afraid. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. That evening, when she returned home, she found the boys wrestling in the yard, laughter ringing against the stone walls like bells. Her husband sat nearby, mending a net they used once a year when fish filled the stream. He looked up and smiled, no question in his eyes, only recognition. "You're back," he said. "I never left," she replied. But she understood what he meant, and he understood what she said. That night she opened her pouch again, not out of need, but ritual. She removed each item slowly, laying them out on the table like chapters of a story. The dried leaf from the first garden, the clove from the old woman, the thread from her mother, the folded page with her name stitched inside. She touched each one, not to remember, but to affirm. They were not relics. They were pieces of her. Evidence. She rewrapped them carefully and placed the pouch back on the shelf, no longer worn at the waist. It didn't need to follow her anymore. She had become it. Before sleep, she stood at the window. The moon was low, large, golden as bread. The air smelled of damp stone and the promise of green things. She whispered, "I am not waiting for anything." And it was true. No messenger, no pardon, no explanation. She did not need to be chosen again. She had chosen herself. And in that quiet, she finally understood the girls who came before her and the ones who would come after. Not all would be free, not all would survive, but some would, and some would carry more than memory. They would carry the name, hers or one like it, as proof that staying, choosing, growing in hard soil was possible. The house had aged with her, bending in the same places she had, the corners softening, the beams creaking a little more each season. But it stood. Even after all the winters, even after all the words left unspoken. It stood. She moved through it now without hesitation. The walls no longer whispered of duty or caution. They echoed her pace, responded to her breath. That morning she found the younger boy in the garden, not playing, but digging, not wildly, but with intent. "What are you doing?" she asked, crouching beside him. He didn't look up. "You said things grow better in soil that's been turned by someone who understands it." She blinked, startled not by the words, but by the fact that he had listened. He pressed a small seed into the ground, then paused. "Did you ever think of leaving?" he asked suddenly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed her hand on the soil beside his. "Yes," she said. "Many times." He looked up then. "Why didn't you?" She thought for a moment, then said, "Because I wanted to see what I could make if I stayed." He considered that, then returned to his planting. That evening, she opened the chest at the foot of her bed and laid the finished embroidery on top. She smoothed it with both hands, the cloth humming with stories. Her name was stitched along the roots, not large, not hidden, just enough. Her husband stood at the door. "You'll pass it down?" he asked. "If they want it," she said. "If they're ready." He nodded. "It's good work." She smiled. "It's more than work." The next morning she left it out in the open, folded gently on the table beneath a stone from the garden. The boys didn't ask whose it was. They understood. The season was changing again, not because the sky said so, but because the rhythm had shifted. Birds were louder, water moved faster. The days held more light, and so did she. At dusk, she sat outside beneath the bare-limbed tree near the fence, watching the last of the sun fall through the branches. The same tree where the matchmaker's cart had once rolled by. She no longer flinched at the memory. She no longer traced her path back to that day. She had made her peace not by forgetting it, but by transforming what came after, from within. That night before sleep, she whispered a single sentence: "Let them know we were more than brides." And in the dark, she imagined girls yet to be born, running through the garden in spring, hands outstretched, not to be caught, but to gather the fruits of survival, the tools of choice, the echo of a name that had never belonged to anyone else. The sun rose early now, slipping through the cracks in the shutters before anyone stirred. She lay awake, not with worry, but with calm, her breath steady, her limbs content. No aches she hadn't earned, no dreams she needed to chase or flee. Just the morning and the room, and the fact that she had made it this far. She rose before the boys and walked the house in silence, touching each beam, each shelf, each wall like a goodbye without sadness. Not an ending, a gesture, the way one might straighten a blanket before a guest arrives. The embroidery lay folded in its usual place, but now she slid it into a new cloth bag, stitched with the same red thread she'd used to mark the turning point months ago. She tied it shut and placed it on the highest shelf. If someone asked for it, they would find it. If not, it would remain, intact, quiet, ready. That afternoon, the woman from the stream arrived again, this time with her daughter in tow, a quiet-eyed girl with clever hands and a way of standing like she already knew where she belonged. They sat together near the fire, the girl watching closely as the women worked. After some time, the girl reached for a needle without asking and began stitching into the edge of a worn cloth. Her thread was uneven, her rhythm unsure, but it was a beginning. She didn't correct her. She didn't hover. She only watched and nodded when the girl looked up. That evening, while the boys were stacking kindling, she stepped outside. The wind carried warmth now. Not the false warmth of early spring, but the deep heat of something that would last. The tree near the fence had budded, green tips pushing forward, bold as breath. Her husband joined her, hands dusted with soil. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm remembering," she replied. "What?" "Everything I never got to say out loud." He nodded, not pressing. Just stood beside her as they watched the horizon. And in the quiet, she finally understood the truth she had been circling all this time. Her life had not been small. It had been detailed, threaded, layered. She had not been reduced. She had been refined. The house would one day crumble. The cloth might fade. The stories would be told differently with each passing year. But something would remain, a pattern, a name, a way of surviving that did not ask permission, that did not need witness to be real, just breath, just choice, just staying. She placed her hand on the door frame one last time before going in, then whispered, "Let them grow." And then she did what women have done since time first marked its path across the sky. She turned inward, turned forward, and kept going.